Of March 25th, 2008 to order. Jackie, could you please read the roll for determination of quorum?
LaCroix,
Here.
Johnson, Hadcock, Hurlbut, McCrepke, Chapman,
Here.
Offenbach, Olson, Kroger, Quaker.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. We do have two items on the special calendar tonight. The first is a Canyon Lake Dam Maintenance Program. With that, Mr. Ellis, if it's all right with the council, I think they wanted some additional information before they acted on this. So if it's all right, permissible with the council, we'll let Mr. Ellis, our new Public Works Director, actually not official yet, is it? Not till Monday night. Give his presentation, then we'll take questions after that. With that, Mr. Ellis.
Thank you. I do have a PowerPoint presentation to give, and I'll go ahead and begin that now. This is a quick summary of the report that was recently done by HDR assessing the condition of the Canyon Lake Dam and then giving their recommendation of what steps should be taken next, and also incorporating some of the comments we heard at the previous council meeting about what are the other alternatives. They wanted some more information on what other alternatives might be. Sure. Is that better? No? This one over here? Is that better? Can you hear me back there? Is that better? Okay. All right. To kick this off, the Canyon Lake Spillway. This is presentation discussing both the dam and the spillway and a couple other projects that we actually have planned up there in that neighborhood in the coming months. Just to give everybody geographical reference of where we're talking. This is a picture of Canyon Lake. The dam you can see there in black. That's better, thank you. The dam is listed there in black, and forgive me, I continue to call it a dam. It's actually a spillway. The dam is the earthen berm around the lake, and just for clarification, dam's in fine shape. It's the spillway that we're really talking about. So I just wanted to make that point. And then also, another thing I'll be talking a lot about tonight is the downstream boil. And that boil is actually located downstream of the dam, more in the Rapid Creek area. And then the sinkhole is located just upstream of the dam in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 feet upstream of the dam. So those are the areas that, that we have concerns about, and we'll be discussing more here. A picture, this is the spillway again. What I keep referring to as a rooster tail. That's what it is. It's just that water percolating out of the face of the dam, and we call that a rooster tail. And then you can see there's a little bit of water seeping at the joint there also. We call that seepage in the spillway. So those are two terms that I'll be saying over and over again throughout this presentation. And then the boil. It doesn't show up real well in this photo, but you can see a little disturbance there in the water. This is in that downstream area, downstream of the spillway in the Rapid Creek area. And you can just see that water is got a little bit of turbulence, and that's where the water's coming up, resurfacing after it's gone underneath the dam. So to talk a little bit about the history of the spillway, of course, it overtopped in 1972 during the event that occurred, and it was reconstructed again in 1976. It was reconstructed much smaller than it was in 72, so there's a less volume of water actually in the canyon today than there was during that significant flood event. There were seepage and boil repairs done in 1986. That was the first major repair project that was done 10 years after it was constructed. You can see again in 1996 we did more seepage and boil repairs. Again in 2006, more of the same repairs. And here we are in 2008 with the recommendation before the council that we take more than just doing repairs. We need to reconstruct it, but we need to do some type of a stopgap in between now and the reconstruction. So as you can see, there's a long history of repairs for seepage and boils on this dam, almost on the order of every 10 years, significant maintenance project. So to talk about the HDR study and what their concerns were, they listed number one, the sinkhole in the lake, number one concern. Secondary, the rooster tail in the spillway. Maybe not secondary, equally important, I would guess. And then the seepage holes throughout the spillway that I identified at the joints. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of those items right there. This is a picture looking across the spillway. So again, you can see the rooster tail down there on the downstream side. And I put together some very crude, very elementary drawings. These are not to scale. They're not engineered documents. I did this actually with paintbrush. So very scaled down, but it gives a good, it helps give a good understanding of what's actually occurring out there. So when you look at a cross-section of the spillway, you've got Canyon Lake, of course, upstream. You've got the spillway itself, which is resting on a clay bedrock core. And then it's a concrete structure spillway. And then, of course, downstream is Rapid Creek. So when you look at the history of this sinkhole and the Rooster Tail, how these originate is it first starts downstream. You've got water that is naturally found in the underground, the underlying clay and bedrock. You got little pockets in there. And they start migrating more because they want to go from the high elevation down to the low elevation. That's just physics. And so it slowly is trying to find the path of least resistance, and it creates these little pockets, and water just slowly starts migrating. And that's fairly natural occurrence, nothing out of the ordinary. However, it starts to carry more and more water. That's where it does become out of the ordinary. And so you can see on the downstream end, as that water is moving, trying to get to Rapid Creek, it's carrying more sediment with it. It's transporting that sediment, and it creates almost a little cavern there, a conduit for that water to move. And you can see the formation of the Rooster Tail is starting because it's found another path of least resistance, which is through one of the joints in the concrete spillway itself. So you get to where we are today, and this is our best representation of what we think is going on out there. You got the sinkhole now is actually developed. You have almost a full conduit going all the way downstream, and you've got another conduit coming out through the face of the spillway where the Rooster Tail is. So in our estimation, this is what we're seeing out there today. So if you continue to allow this to happen, it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so those are the consequences of really not addressing it is, eventually you get to a point where something just is going to happen, something significant. So how are we certain that there's the sinkhole and the water is actually circumventing the spillway itself? We had divers release a dye in the lake, and we just watched and waited to see where the dye reemerged. So you can see here, this is where that boil is downstream of the spillway, and you can see that's where the dye just reemerged. So it didn't come over the spillway, it actually went under it, and it just reemerged here. So we know that there's a sinkhole there. We know that that water is traveling in that fashion. And again, there's a picture of that boil as it's coming out of the water, out of the lake. Excuse me. So HDR study recommendations. Two recommendations, really. There's an immediate concern to do a project, which are the repairs that I'll talk about here in a little bit. And their recommendation is that we should do this within the next 2 months. It's a very urgent project that we need to do to address some of that seepage through the dam and underneath the dam. And what it does is it buys us time to reconstruct it, because a reconstruction project is going to take time. It isn't something you can just start construction or start design on and get finished relatively quick. There's a lot of work and permitting and environmental reviews. There's a lot of work that actually goes into constructing a dam. And then their other recommendation was, of course, long-term, we need to reconstruct the dam or do some serious rehabilitation on it. A very significant project. And the recommendation is that within the next 2 years, we need to have that completed. So to talk a little bit more about the immediate concern project tasks, in the report, it said we need to do a certain number of things. One is monitor it daily. This is something that we're doing right now. We have staff from the Engineering Services Office going out that live, in fact, just a couple footsteps away. So he's monitoring that very vigilantly. I believe the police department also has crews that are going out and taking a look at that on a routine basis, just to get more eyes on it. And when we have rain events, we're going to be out there watching things very intimately, because we just want to make sure that we know exactly what's going on. So that's being done. There's also prepare the emergency response plan. That was a plan that was actually completed, I don't know, decades ago, several years ago. It's been in place for quite some time. We reconvened after we got our hands on this report with all the emergency management offices and just reiterated what everybody's roles are so that we understood what needs to take place if there is some type of an emergency. So that has been done. Again, analyze the downstream impact of the breach. That was completed as part of the emergency response plan, and it's in there. They did use information from the 72 flood, which was essentially a 500-year storm and a large dam collapse. So we know the breach area. However, now it's much smaller, and that's being revisited as we speak. The National Weather Service has been provided some information, and they're going to model exactly what that inundation area is. And from our estimates, in doing some calculations of the volume of water that was there in 72 versus the volume of water that could be there at broom capacity now, we're talking 20% of the volume of water that was there in 72. So the threat is much less significant than it was in 72. It doesn't have the volume of water in there that we saw during that event. So that's something that's very important. The inundation area is going to be much smaller than it was during that event. And then other recommendations, of course, address the sinkhole and the seepage, and to complete these tasks in the next 2 months. And the estimated cost of that is $150,000 to $250,000. So how do you actually make those repairs to the sinkhole? Again, this is today's situation. You got the sinkhole, the rooster tail, the downstream boil. With the repairs that we've been discussing, what you would do is you would actually put a mix of bentonite, granular material, sand, rock, and you gradually get larger and heavier over the sinkhole, and you just essentially pump that conduit where the water is traveling with the bentonite. Bentonite will react with water, it swells, and it essentially works to plug that hole. And then as far as the rooster tail goes, there are a number of polyurethanes or polyureas that can work even submerged in water, that can be used to actually caulk, in a way, those that rooster tail and some of the cracks in the dam. So we feel that there's technology out there, there are methods out there to address the sinkhole, and those are what some of the things that we would like to have HDR take a look at in more detail. And then HDR's study recommendations, again, was the long-term concern project, which was the reconstruction or the rehabilitation of the spillway within 2 years. Some of the other projects that we actually have planned out there that you may be aware of is the bypass piping project, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's a Vision 2012 project, and it's something that we were going to use to facilitate the reconstruction of the dam, and that is something that's planned. Of course, spillway reconstruction, we have been making requests to our federal delegation to receive some funding to help us with that. So this has been something that we've known about, we've been trying to get funding for. It's only recently that we've learned that we need to act much faster than maybe perhaps waiting for that federal funding to come in. And then the third project is actually dredging the bottom of that lake, because the bottom of that lake has a lot of sediments. You've got the fish hatchery upstream, you've got geese, you've got fires that have happened up in the hills, and that ash essentially washes down into this sediment basin. And so you've got a lot of sediments, so you've got a lot of stuff at the bottom of that lake that needs to be dredged out about every 10 years. So we were aware of that as well. Talking a little bit about the bypass piping project, we're just getting underway with that. Again, it's a Vision 2012 project. I believe there's $390,000 in it from Vision 2012. We've got the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks is also a funding partner. I believe they're in it for somewhere around $300,000. We've also got the Black Hills Fly Fishers, our partners, and the West Dakota Water Development District. So we're all partnering together to actually build that bypass and design it. So we're just getting underway with that. We're looking at a design in the summer of '08. We were planning to do construction in 2008, and the ultimate cost is going to be just under $1 million for that project. Now with the bypass, I've got a couple alternate layouts here for bypass that we've initially considered. But what the bypass does is it catches the water from Rapid Creek before it comes into the lake. It diverts it around the lake and back into Rapid Creek. And the purpose of this is when we do go in there and dredge out the bottom of the lake, which we know we have to do periodically every 10 years, what we'd like to do is open up that bypass, let the creek continue to flow with clean water, cold water for the fishery that's downstream, and allow us to actually muck out that lake without having any environmental consequences like we had the last time we dredged the lake. But that bypass can also work in our advantage if it were in place, if you had to do spillway reconstruction or dam reconstruction, because you can divert the water around the lake while you're actually doing the repairs on it. The spillway reconstruction and dredging, again, recommended that design begin on that very soon. And looking at a timeline for that reconstruction, construction this winter may be possible. And I really stress that may, because there are a number of things that go into a dam. There are a lot of eyes, a lot of federal agencies, state agencies that review it. You've got a lot of interested parties, such as the wildlife people, the Game Fish and Parks. You've got the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. You've got the Army Corps of Engineers. And things just take time. Honestly, getting the permits in place, getting the reviews will take time. And it may be possible, but I certainly can't guarantee that it could be done this winter. Again, our RFP process, that adds a little bit of time. Advertising, letting, notice to proceed, all those steps do add time to the project. We have estimated that the cost of the project would be between $1.5 and $2.5 million for that reconstruction and the dredging. At the previous council meeting, we were asked to come back to you with some alternatives other than what HDR has recommended. And so I'll go over those. And I'll start off with the temporary repairs with no lake draining, which is essentially what HDR did recommend. But I want to go through the pros and cons very specifically so that you understand the ramifications of that alternative. Also, draining the lake and not doing any repairs, just draining it and waiting to do the reconstruction. And then finally, drain the lake and do temporary repairs. So I'll go through those three options. Those were the three viable ones that we had thought about. So I'll go through the pros and cons of each of those. But I do want to point out that all those alternatives are going to require a reconstruction or major rehabilitation of that spillway. I just don't see any other way around that. So talking about temporary repairs where you do not drain the lake. That's what this alternative is. So you're going to leave the water in the lake and you're going to make these temporary repairs. You would repair the sinkhole, the rooster tail, and the seepage. We feel we could get this done in 30 to 45 days, but we would need to declare this project as an emergency so that we can act faster. The temporary repairs, with again, not draining the lake, the pros of that approach are the repairs could buy anywhere from 1 to 2 years. We feel that you can buy a level of safety of that to buy you the time that you need to actually get a dam or the spillway reconstructed. There are less environmental consequences. And I'll really explain those in the next options, what those environmental consequences are. But we feel with this option, there aren't going to be as many environmental consequences as with the others. Another pro, it keeps the park in operation. I mean, that park sees a lot of tourists. It sees a lot of local people. There are a lot of diverse users of that park. And this option would allow them to continue to use that all summer long, which is, again, obviously the high use season for the park. Now, the cons, the unknown. I mean, we could have a 200, 100, 500-year event. We could, something catastrophic could happen. We can't guarantee that it won't happen. And so there is that unknown factor. That unknown factor has existed since the day the dam was essentially reconstructed. One thing that's different now is that we have a greenway in place. In 1972, there wasn't a greenway in place, and a lot of the damage that we saw was because of that. We've taken a lot of steps, or this city has taken a lot of steps, to remove those types of obstructions, those types of threats within that greenway. And so we've done a lot of protecting of people and property by acquiring and getting that greenway dedicated to the city. Another con is the initial cost. We don't really know. We don't have a good handle on exactly what it'll cost. We feel that it's going to be relatively low in the $100,000 to $250,000, but I can't tell you exactly what that's going to cost. Now, looking at the next alternative, which is drain the lake and do not do any temporary repairs. Essentially, let all the water out and begin the process of reconstructing the dam. So the pros are, some might say it reduces risk. I guess you could look at that at both ways. It may reduce risk to property downstream, but I think it creates a lot of risk financially and to other stakeholders in the viability of Rapid Creek. And I say that because of the pollution that I know that this option is going to cause. And in speaking to that, under the cons, Rapid Creek pollution fines. I don't know how you can drain that lake without polluting Rapid Creek. I really don't think it's possible without spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars putting in measures that would remove any silt that is sitting at the bottom of that lake. And the reason I say that is especially during the spring and summer seasons, every time it rains, you're going to have a large volume of water come down into that lake, and that lake is essentially going to be a large mud pit. And every time it's disturbed with that action of the water, it's going to turn into mud. I mean, the creek will turn into mud, and it's going to have to go somewhere because, I mean, that lake can only hold so much water. And when you get a large rain event, it's going to go over the spillway like it was designed to do, or it's going to have to be pumped out, or whatever method you want to use to keep that lake drained, the mud is going to go with it downstream. I can just guarantee you that. And, of course, with that comes fines. I mean, Rapid City learned a lesson the last time that we did try to dredge that lake, and I believe we ended up with some fines because of that very reason in the magnitude of the $200,000 to $250,000. Another con is the decaying material will create an odor. If that lake were drained and it were allowed to sit there, especially during the summer conditions, there's a lot of bacteria, there's a lot of decaying material that are sitting in that lake, and it will create an odor. And it will be a very big nuisance to the people that live in that surrounding area because it will be a very strong odor. And it'll also, might have skipped a couple of things there, it'll also be a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And you see that up there. And visiting with the Parks Department, that was a big issue, dealing with the mosquitoes that were created the last time we did drain that lake. And the population just exploded for mosquitoes up there. So that's another unintended consequence of that. Again, park user impacts. The park essentially will not be a very attractive park during the summer of 2008 if that were the option chosen. And then also, financial costs. There's the fines for pollution, a very real possibility. But also, if we're looking at pumping that lake all summer long, every time it rained, we'd have to pump it out. You know, anytime there's flows in there, pump it out. The costs for pumping that are going to be very significant. And I feel very comfortable saying that if we were to pump that all summer long, the cost might be just as much as doing these immediate repairs. You know, we don't have those pumps. We'd have to either rent them or buy them. The electrical costs of doing that, the maintenance of going up there and continually monitoring those pumps. I see a very real cost to that option. And again, I'll reiterate, it'll be difficult, nearly impossible to manage the water coming into that lake if our goal is to always keep it essentially drained. I just don't know how you can do it during the spring and summer conditions. The volume of water we're talking is just more than we could really pump out. Drain the lake and do temporary repairs. I listed this as an option. I don't see a lot of benefit to this, but I'll go through those. The pros, again, you could say it reduces the risk because there's no water in the lake. The cons, may be possible, it may not be possible to actually fix the sinkhole if there's no water in there. I think we'd need that water to help that bentonite migrate through those fissures, through that conduit underneath the spillway. We need that head, the pressure on the water to push it down and to suck it out on the downstream side. So without having the water there, I think it's going to inhibit our ability to actually fix that sinkhole. I believe it's a more costly alternative because now you're doing both. You're fixing the sinkhole and you're draining the lake. So you could very well double your costs. And then again, just issues with draining the lake. So just to leave you with the summary, staff summary, taking into account the recommendations that we got from HDR Engineering. We still stand with the recommendation of doing the immediate spillway repairs, which is fixing the rooster tail, fixing the sinkhole. We'd recommend that this be an emergency declaration so that we can act as fast as possible. We'd also recommend constructing the bypass this winter or even possibly earlier, as soon as we possibly can, and then reconstruct the spillway as soon as possible. And if that means this winter, we'll certainly make a goal of that. If it means a little bit after that, we'll work as hard as we can to get that project actually completed. Now, the concerns of that, again, the unknown. I can't promise anything. I can't promise that, that something might happen. I don't think anybody really can. So there is that concern of the unknown. But the benefits are, and I believe they outweigh the concerns are, it allows for the possibility of federal funding. This is a multi-million-dollar project. We've made a request for that funding to pay for this project. And I think we stand a good chance of receiving something, if not all of it, something for that for this project, because I believe our delegation understands that this is a concern for our community, very real concern. And so I think we might have a little bit of help on the federal funding side. It may allow the use of the bypass, and I think that's going to significantly reduce costs of construction. And in my opinion, the most important thing, there's less environmental consequences, the pollution, the mosquitoes, the odors, there's less financial risk to the city. And so I consider all of those very important reasons to essentially go with the recommendation that we presented before you. So that concludes my summary of the report, and I can certainly field any questions.
Very good. Questions? Well, that was strange. Let's see. Let's go to Alderman Karen Olson.
Thank you very much. My first question for Robert is to understand the bypass as it's described. Its intent all along as a 2012 project was to provide colder water because as I understand it, the water collects in the lake, the temperature rises somewhat. And so the question I have is, does the bypass operate all the time under, would it operate all the time to bypass some water around the lake?
Mr. Ellis.
I don't believe that it'll operate all the time. I think that part of what we're going to look at with all of our financial partners on that is coming up with a maintenance plan on when that bypass is going to be operational. We certainly know during maintenance it will be, and we also want to take a look at during the peak summer season when we do have elevated temperatures and the temperature of that lake rises. If it gets to a point where we need to open up the bypass to protect the downstream fisheries, I think that's what's going to come out of that examination, but a very real possibility, but I can't say for any certainty that it'll be operational either year-round or all summer long. But during the key hot summer temperatures, my guess is it will be.
I have a couple questions, Mayor.
Go
Can I
ahead, please,
continue?
Karen.
So the pipe, as we're describing it, and in the report, and as I've visited with constituents about this issue, there is no pipe through the dam or through the spillway. What you're describing is a geological description. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Ellis.
That's correct. We engineers use the term piping to describe water's natural ability to create its own pipe.
Okay.
There really is no pipe underneath the spillway. So.
Okay, that's important, as I've tried to explain it to people. Also, the report indicates this dam is classified as a high hazard dam, but the reason for that is because of the possibility of risk to the downstream safety of people. So that the dam itself is not high risk. It is high risk because of the existing condition of people who live below the dam. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Ellis.
That is correct. This dam was classified as a Class 1 high hazard dam the day it was constructed. In fact, before it was constructed, it was given that classification, and that classification is given to all dams that are above a populated area. So, yes.
And this is a question I don't need an answer to right at the moment, Robert, but you referenced the fact that there is considerable greenway below the dam which does increase the safety. I've had a few people ask me what the volume of those spaces would be, and I don't need an answer for that right now, but I have been asked that question. I'd like to be able to answer it. And then lastly, when you're talking about pollution, you've alluded to a number of agencies, and one of the agencies under Stormwater Phase 2, we are obligated to guarantee a certain level of quality to the water. And would Stormwater Phase 2 be a part of our violations if we had a substantial increase in sedimentation that's traveling in Rapid Creek and leaving the municipal boundaries of our city?
Mr. Ellis.
In a way, it would. The Phase 2 requirements that have been imposed on Rapid City are that when we do construction projects, we put measures in place to protect the environment. So we would, by the very nature, be required to put those measures in place. However, this project, because it is being reviewed by Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Game, Fish, and Parks, they're going to require probably even more stringent controls be put in place. So if we were not a Phase 2 community, we would be held to the same standard just because of the potential risk for the pollution.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Very good. Thank you. Let's next go to Alderman Lloyd LaCroix.
Thank you, Mayor. Robert, in 1986, they did the Kenyon Lake Spillway Maintenance Project, and they got down that during the project, they installed a 1-foot wide cutoff wall at the upstream face of the spillway. They cleaned and sealed the concrete joints and filled the voids beneath the concrete structure with sand. Then afterwards, the Corps of Engineers report following all those repairs, they note there was continued seepage under the spillway, and at that time they identified a sinkhole upstream from the structure back in 1986. So here we are 20 years later, and we've identified them before. And since 1986, we've drained Kenyon Lake and dredged it, and we didn't do no repairs back in 2005 or did nothing with the sinkholes back then. Is that because it didn't come all the way up underneath it at that point in time, or do you have any idea for that, Robert?
Mr. Ellis.
I'll be honest, I can only guess as to what occurred back in 2005. It was identified, it appears in 1986, that there was a sinkhole. Perhaps where it was at, how much water was not known, just the fact that it appears there's a sinkhole here. I do believe that in 2005, when we did the dye testing, and maybe even a little bit earlier, that perhaps here in 1996, we looked for those voids that would be causing that sinkhole, but we never did find them. We thought, I believe the city believed at that time that it was going through the spillway and they were looking at injecting that with concrete. However, when they drained the lake, they found that there was no cavity in the spillway itself. So It might be that the time passed, the lake drained, they thought that was the issue, they weren't certain, and they let it rise again, and they just continued to monitor it, but I'm only speaking on suspicion of what I think occurred. I have no facts.
Alderman LaCroix, you still have the floor, sir.
Oh, thank you. And then in 2006, we did that filter berm over some boils. And do you think that increased the rooster tail through the dam?
If I could refer back to the presentation that I had prepared here. This is the slide that showed the recommended repairs. In 2006, the project that was done was essentially the downstream boil. They placed rock over the boil. I think
Yeah.
they must have thought that, you know, put your hand over it, it'll stop the leak. It's very possible that it just could have forced that water to find a new route, which is where the rooster tail become more prominent. It's very possible. I'm personally not an expert in dam construction. We do have HDR here that may be able to answer those questions, but I suspect that, yeah, that may have led to the rooster tail having more water come out of it because they essentially blocked, for the time being, the downstream boil.
Thank you, Robert.
Mr. LaCroix, anything else?
I'm done.
Very good, thank you. We have a light on from Alderman Deb Hadcock.
Hi, Robert. Just a question on the issues with the geological things that are underneath this. We still don't know basically how many sinkholes we have or what's happening. We know what's going underneath the dam. We don't know how many sinkholes there are. Am I correct?
That is correct. We don't know with any certainty exactly how many sinkholes there are. We know they're all co-located within the same general area. So a project, and we would certainly go beyond the scope of just the area where we know where the one sinkhole is to cover all the other possible locations. The good thing about it is they're all relatively close to one another. The downstream boil, the sinkhole, we're not talking hundreds of yards apart from one another. We know all the issues are right there immediately upstream of the spillway. So whatever route's taken on the emergency repairs, we were going to broadcast that entire area to make sure that we take care of any other possible sources.
Is this the same area that they filled last year?
Mr.
Or is
Ellis.
this a different area?
Now the last time a project was done, again, if I could refer back to this slide here,
Okay.
the only thing that was done was on the downstream boil. That was the only thing that was done, and I think that kind of missed the whole issue altogether. I think you need to start upstream where the water is being sucked down, and you need to fill it that way rather than just put your hand over the hole on the downstream end, because it will find another route. I mean,
But isn't
that's
it
proof
safe
today.
to say that this is limestone, bedrock, and clay, which maybe if you plug one hole, this area underneath could be like Swiss cheese and have many holes in it?
Sure.
And just come from, you'll plug one and then actually start eroding another one from plugging one piece of it.
Mr. Ellis.
I didn't really explain this in the presentation. I didn't know if you wanted to hear this or not, but I can go into that in a little bit more detail. The core that the spillway sits on, you see it there in the kind of the greenish brown color. About midway through the spillway, and if you look on this diagram right here, midway through the spillway, that spillway is actually sitting on a bedrock.
Right.
And then from midpoint closer towards the park area, the high use area of the park, it's actually sitting on a clay liner. You have two dissimilar materials there.
Okay.
That's it. Mechanics of engineering will tell you that's always going to be the weak link when you have two dissimilar materials together. And I suspect that may be where this piping or this routing of the water underneath the spillway is occurring, because you've got bedrock and then you have clay. And how do you compact the two together? I mean, it's difficult. So I suspect that has something to do with it. However, the bentonite being pumped into that little cavern or that fissure there should be able to find all those voids and plug them. And again, it's only a temporary. I mean, this is a 1 to 2 years that you're buying here. I would never advocate doing this as the permanent fix or going in every 2 years and pumping with bentonite. So.
But Robert, has anybody done any, I guess what I looked into on vacation was something called a seismic profile. And that actually gives the whole area and what's underneath of it. they do that for aquifers and different things, and I don't know if that would work for this, but it seems like you'd want to know what's underneath before you just start filling again and doing a temporary fix, even before, or even when we do the whole new repair or reconstruction of this. So it seems to me that we don't really know what's underneath. We're just going to see if we can fill what is. And again, it's limestone, bedrock, and clay, and there could be a lot of holes. And my other issue was the plan or for the temporary fix and the costs of that without knowing that plan or how much that would really cost. Because again, if you don't know how many holes you're filling or how much you're filling, you don't know the cost either. So, and another thing.
Deb, did you want him to answer that?
Go ahead, Robert. Am I
You've
talking
rattled
too
about two
fast?
questions, so I
Sorry.
just want to give him the opportunity.
Sorry, Robert, am I going too fast?
To address the first question,
Okay.
when I say reconstruction of the dam being completed or started this winter very difficult, it's because there is a lot of geotech analysis that needs to go into the reconstruction and redesign of the dam. I think there were some mistakes made back in the 70s when this was first designed and constructed. I just want to make sure we don't repeat that. And it is going to take a thorough analysis. So I agree with you. Yes, we need that seismic imaging underneath to find out exactly what we're dealing with. I think would be very beneficial during the reconstruction. I don't know that it's necessarily needed right now. The second question, I believe, was, I forget,
Costs.
Cost.
cost. We do have a gentleman here in the audience tonight. He actually does this type of work in Wyoming for the oil and gas industry, and he might be better apt to answer some of those questions. Derek, are you willing to speak?
Deb, did you have a specific what? Did you?
Just kind of a basic, I guess without knowing the geology underneath, how are we going to figure the costs, or are we not, I shouldn't say not worried about the cost, but I kind of would like, when you have a project, to know somewhat of what it's going to cost in order to do this, and if we're going to spend $500,000 to fix it, or if we're going to spend a substantial amount. It seems to me that you'd either want to drain some of the water out, maybe not all of it, Robert, and I don't know if that's a fix, because you said if we drain it all out, there's mud, but what if we took some of the safety factor off of it and some of the risk out of it by taking some of the water out of it and not making such a load on that spillway? Maybe that would help with some of the temporary fix, I don't know, but I guess I just ran this through a couple people that I knew down there in Arizona that were engineers, and they said the main thing is the safety risk and the weight of the water going on that spillway. So I'll let him answer
Robert,
the costs.
real quickly, I know that there was a dollar amount within the report. Can you just state that? I think it was in your presentation.
Yeah, I believe it was in the $150,000 to $250,000 price range.
Okay.
Okay. Sir, could you identify yourself for the record?
My name's Tony Merriam. I'm from Newell, South Dakota. My business is 221 Linings and Coatings. I don't speak in public. I work in the oil field, so you're going to have to cut me some slack. To answer your question, ma'am, the pumping of bentonite into a substrate of this nature is quite a bit like what we do in the Powder River Basin for the coal bed methane industry. You can't see underneath the ground, but it's almost the exact same scenario that I'm used to working with, except we have a concrete cap over the top of it. More than likely, I was out there today looking at it, and it's just a matter of observation, ma'am. It's not a matter of science. I believe that that water is following the concourse of the limestone around in a big loop and coming out in the middle of your dam.
Right.
Hypothetically, if the gentleman at HDR can get me on target with my equipment, I can pump enough bentonite into that C-pole to plug that system. Now, the more holes are in it, the more porous it becomes, the more hydrodynamic pressure. In other words, the weight of the water will force that bentonite into the crevices and into the cracks. Now, limestone's, in its engineering standpoint, is pretty similar to the coal seams that I work with over there. So this is almost the same case scenario of what we do over there. Theoretically, after looking at it a second time, I know I told the gentleman here at the engineering department yesterday, maybe 3 truckloads. You know, if I'm not shooting in the dark, if they can get me right on target, we could probably handle 4 truckloads to get this started to make sure that we're on the right spot. And we charge $1,000 a ton to do that, and that's almost $100,000 bucks.
There you go.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate that information, sir.
Deb, you still have the floor, ma'am.
Just one more thing I looked into. Tempe, I don't know if we can do that in Rapid City to our dam, but they have a rubber dam that is on the Salt River Lake, or Salt River, I'm sorry, not Salt River Lake. They actually make a lake out of these 2 rubber dams, and they look like real dams, and they actually are very innovative for this type of thing where you have to drain the lake a lot in order to repair it and do different things. And I thought that might be something that would maybe work for our type of soils and bedrock that we have. But it was just some stuff I looked into with a couple people down there that were engineers for some different issues. But that's something I could share with you later, or you can look into later. But I appreciate all the information, Robert.
Thank you, Deb. Anything else? Okay. Let's go to Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. Robert, I have a couple of questions. First of all, regarding the just a general statement, on the city's website, I realize there's a lot of information already on the first page, but I'm sure hoping that we can link this report to the city's website. If we could do that, that would be great. Thank you. On page 9 of the report, which would be page 11 of the PDF file, at page 9, subtask 2.3, called sinkhole mitigation, and underneath that is 2.3.1 under preparing construction plans. It says the emergency effort relating to plugging the sinkhole. The emergency effort would be best performed by draining the reservoir, cleaning out the sinkhole area, and installing a graded material, coarse gravel, etc. As an alternative, sealing of the sinkhole could be attempted from a barge without draining the reservoir. Am I correct in understanding, Robert, that HDR's recommendation is to go with the alternative?
Robert?
I hate to put words in HDR's mouth. They are here tonight. I think after having weighed all the other possibilities for problems with draining the lake, the second alternative is a more feasible. And knowing that we have somebody that can do that, the gentleman that spoke earlier does have equipment that he can do this with a full lake. He's got equipment that will actually go out into the lake and dump it over the top. And that may not have been known when this report was officially or was initially put together. So unless HDR has anything to add to that.
You still have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. If HDR would be willing to speak to that, because the essence of the report is the original recommendation for drainage under this subsection, but the recommendation now appears to be to go with the alternative. And I'd just like to understand a little bit more why we would seek that route.
Certainly.
Nergen, if you'd identify yourself for the record, please.
Good evening, Mayor, Council. My name is Mike Coleman. I'm with HDR Engineering. It became apparent from meetings when we started setting up the scope. I firmly believe that if we could drain the lake and do a complete sealing of any sinkholes, that the gentleman was correct in the assumption that the bedrock clay interface is probably the most likely spot. If we could seal that, one of our recommendations on our report talked about using a geotextile and bridging that entire spot. But it became apparent quickly that with the game and fish and the irrigators and the numerous requirements that are in place on this reservoir, that it wouldn't be feasible to drain this reservoir till September. So as a stopgap measure to protect the reservoir from the high flows that will take place in the near approximately May 15th to July 4th, this became the preferred alternative given the timing. I hope that answered your question.
Alderman Quake, you still have the floor, sir.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, very good. Thank you. Let's go to Alderman Ron Kroger.
Thank you, Mayor. Robert, just a couple of questions. Has there been any modeling done regarding if there was a dam failure and what effects the failure of that dam would be downstream?
Robert?
Isn't that something that we can do? I mean, one of the concerns I certainly have is what effects all this piping and stuff is done to the spillway. And, you know, if we do this fix and there's damage to the structure or whatever it might be, that would give a failure in the time it took us to design and to replace that dam. So certainly, I mean, there's certainly not a whole lot of water. The good thing, there's not a whole lot of water in that lake to begin with, but with the greenway we have downstream, there certainly should be a way that we can model to see what kind of effects, if there was a dam failure, what would happen downstream. Is that something that we can do?
Robert?
In-house, no, we don't have that modeling software to do it. However, I've been working with Pennington County Emergency Management Office, and we've been providing information to the National Weather Service as well as, I believe, the Army Corps of Engineers, because they are looking at that modeling. So it's being done. I don't have something in hand to show you tonight, but we've given them all the information they need to actually model it. So it is something that's being done.
Is there a time frame on that?
I don't know about that.
Just, Robert, you might want to touch, I believe that you also in your presentation talked about 20% volume versus what was in the lake during the 1972 flood. So, I mean, that'll give us some indication. There's only about 20% of the volume of the water currently in that lake.
Than there was prior to 1972.
Yes. And that was before there was a greenway put in place
And
also.
I guess just one other comment. During the flood of 1972, it wasn't the spillway then that failed either. It was the north side of the dam, probably, I don't know what, 7,500, 200 feet up from the spillway itself. So, I would like to have some modeling to know what effects would happen if we make the decision to try and plug the piping and then design it. Because, I mean, that's the big concern for everybody up here is, no one's given us a firm, it ain't going to happen, there's nothing wrong with the dam. Everybody's saying, yes, it could fail at any time. So that doesn't give a whole lot of reassurance for us that are making a decision up here which way we want to go. But, certainly what would happen today with the dam failure versus what happened in the 72 flood, I mean, there's no comparison. And I think there would be minimal damage, but I'd like to know that for certain.
Robert, any comments? Okay, let's run. You still have the floor. Is there anything else?
No, that's
very good. Let's go. Let's see. Alderman Tom Johnson has not spoken. We'll go to Alderman Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. There are a number of things. First of all, one of the questions I had was, how do we get to be a high hazard dam? And I think that was answered earlier. And my assumption was, and it's a little bit confusing in this report, it almost gives you the idea that now, because of the condition of the dam, we now have a high hazard dam, and that's not true. So I think that's one of the first things that I believe that we have to dispose of, because it lends you to believe that we need to do something right now because we now are in the attainment of high hazard, which we're not. The condition of the dam has not changed, and that's not because of the condition of the dam. There are a number of things in the report that I had wanted to ask. One of the things Ron just referred to, and I'll start with that, was, you put up the pros and the cons of draining the lake. But I think that the pros were very short-ended. I don't think that all things were considered. I think that there are opportunities not necessarily to drain the entire dam. I mean, that would say, like, we should stop Rapid Creek from flowing because there's a potential of flooding. If you reduce the amount of water in the dam, you reduce the pressure, and you reduce the pressure that goes through some of those areas you were talking about. It increases the boil and the other area that actually takes in the water. You also reduce the pressure on that water that squirts out the dam. So I think that we should consider at 100% level, at 50% level, at 25% level. Obviously, if you still have water in there, you don't have the mosquitoes, you don't have the mud, you don't have the silt. My understanding was that we've drained this lake a number of times in the past. The last time we did it, we drained it quicker than we had in the past. By draining the lane quicker, I believe we had more silt. More silt brought us a problem with, I don't remember whether it was DENR or whether it was the Corps of Engineers or whoever it was. We had a negotiated fine of a couple $100,000, which was unfortunate because I don't think there was any loss of life of any fish. We agreed to pay some money, and we paid some money. Only to find out less than a year later, the city of Sturgis had an overtopping, and their sewer lagoon went straight into the creek. And there had to be some loss of life, and there was nothing done. I think we were treated differently with the state than the city of Sturgis, which I thought was fairly unfortunate. So I would like to have a modeling, as Ron talked about, of what would the effects be if there was a failure of, I would say, the spillway. We keep saying the dam, but we're not talking about the dam. You had me so confused the first meeting because the dam is different than the spillway. What would be the effects of a failure of the spillway? And as noted in the in the plan here, you assume that there are different ways the dam could fail. It could be a complete failure all at once. It could be a partial failure. A partial failure would send less water down the creek. I would remind the council and the community that we have a very well-defined flood area that we didn't have before. There was talk that we have 20% of the water in Canyon Lake than we had during the 72 flood. I don't think it was the lake itself that created the problem. It was the wall of water coming down Dark Canyon. So you not only have 80% less water, you also have water come down Dark Canyon. And this report almost brings fear into folks. So I wanted to bring that up as well. So I think it's important to me to find out what the modeling has, and also if there are benefits in reducing the level of the water. And I wouldn't propose to drain totally the water out anyway. So if you go back to your pros and cons page, if you would please, on draining the dam. The reason why I say I think you're shortening it out, the pros you have reduces the risk. I just quickly wrote a few notes here, and I'm not an engineer, but I could see if I can get to the right page. What page is that, Robert? Do you know?
This is almost towards the end. I'd say 3 or 4 towards the end, from the end.
In the pros, I could say certainly has to reduce risk. The risk is that you have a lot of water, and to even have a reduces risk and a question mark there, I think doesn't reflect that at all. I believe that there's a potential of less cost too. If you reduce the water and you reduce the pressure, and you reduce the pressure to actually make it through those piping areas, because the less pressure there are, the less there will be degrading that whole thing. I believe you can reduce the cost. I believe the way to do this whole thing is to, as quickly as you can, rebuild the spillway and attack those areas that allow the seepage to go through there. We're talking about a temporary fix. We're talking about a fix that's 100 to 150 to 200,000. I believe is a one-time 2-year fix. I believe you put that onto the permanent fix. So I believe that the pros obviously absolutely reduce risk. Could be a potential of lost cost, and you could maybe get a one-time fix, which I think is important. The other thing is, I've heard throughout this whole process, we don't know, what's the word I'm thinking of, not the boils, but what's the other end of it? No, that feeds in from the sinkhole. You don't know quite where the sinkholes are, and you don't know how many sinkholes there are. Well, my guess is that if you have less water in that lake, you'll have a better idea and a better way to find where those areas are. So I think there are more pros than cons. So I'm not as impressed with the pros and cons as you put up here. The other thing is that, and going back to the draining of the lake, we had a problem with silt last time because we drained the lake fairly quickly. We wanted to get the project done. When we've drained the lake in a slower fashion, I don't think we've had that silt problem, which we've done in the past. So I don't know that that's undoable. A question that I may have, and I'm not sure how our spillway works, does the spillway just release the water that goes over the top, or is there a way to actually drain that without pumping?
Mr. Ellis.
The spillway will not allow you to drain it. There's no mechanism to actually drain the lake through the spillway. I believe when the dam was originally constructed, some gate valve out there. I don't know how operational it is, that allows the water to go through the raceway in the park. I don't know if it works or not, to be honest with you. It hasn't been open for a decade or better.
I would suggest that we find out if that does work. That would give an opportunity to reduce the level of that lake. I believe that there are other opportunities than to just run and do a temporary fix. Let me check my notes here as well. I believe the bypass you indicated was 390,000. I looked it up in 2012 and I saw it as 400,000. Maybe there's been some kind of a switch. I guess that'll be all for now. I'll read my notes here. I'd made quite a few notes prior to coming here tonight. I'd made some notes while you went through your presentation, but I think that you can lessen the need by simply reducing the water. The water's the danger. And what we're really talking about is the possibility of a flood or that spillway breaking. So if you reduce the level of the water, you reduce the pressure and you reduce the impact if there is a failure. And I believe if you can reduce the impact for a fairly short period of time, you can come with a long-term fix, spend the money once and do it right. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Robert, you have a comment?
I did. I forgot to mention on here something about drinking water taste and odor issues, and last time we did drain the lake, I believe there were some serious issues with when you drain that lake, you get a bacteria and algae bloom in that water because you got high temperatures, you've got perfect spawning ground for that type of activity. And this is the drinking water that we use down at the Mountain View water purification plant. And when we did that about 10 years ago, there were significant taste and odor issues with the water. I don't know, I wasn't around then, I've only heard about the stories, but I forgot to mention that is something to consider as well. And I do have, not sure exactly how to operate this here, but.
Marcia, can you give us? I'd come help, but I don't know either.
There we go. Thanks, Marcia. Yep. Oh yeah. Okay, this is. This comes from the emergency, the Canyon Lake Dam Emergency Preparedness Plan. This is the document I referred to earlier that we've had in place for quite some time. This is the inundation zone map. Now keep in mind, I was a little bit hesitant to show this because this is the 1972 flood, which my understanding was categorized as about a 500-year event, and Canyon Lake Dam was a little bit larger then. So this kind of outlined the area that was inundated, my understanding of that event. So I qualify that by saying that the volume of water in there when the dam's full and its configuration today is about 20% of what it was during this event. So the modeling has been done. It's been done for a much larger event though, and this is the inundation area. So it's going to be significantly smaller than what you're seeing now, significantly.
Okay, very good. Alderman Johnson, do you have anything else? If not, we can come back to you.
Just one comment on the last thing, the inundation area. You remember during the 72 flood, we had a wall of water that came down Dark Canyon, which is a pretty big body of water. You had rain coming down, which I don't know how many inches we had an hour, but it was significant. And the dam was a lot bigger. This particular drawing, I don't think represents what the reality is if there's just a dam failure. And I think that's important to note. Not only do you have 80% less water, you don't have a wall of water coming down Dark Canyon, and you don't have rain coming down. That's probably some of the heaviest rains I've ever experienced in my life. Those are my comments. That's I wouldn't say the best map to put on there. That would be a worst case scenario, and you'd have more water coming down Dark Canyon to ever make that. You might have a failure of Pactola. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to, let's see, Alderman Bob Hurlbut has not spoke yet. We'll go to Bob Hurlbut.
Thank you, Mayor. I think as Alderman Kroger and Johnson have both alluded to, the absence of modeling here is to me a critical factor because without that modeling, I think all we're doing is we're working on fear of unknown that, quite frankly, I'm really surprised we don't. Given the lingering effect of the 72 flood in the Rapid City community, that we don't have modeling to now show what a risk of dam or spillway failure would result in. But we're told it's about 20% of the former volume, and it's all of what was housing areas is now greenway. So my guess is this is a very remote risk to any human life at all, maybe other than golfers on Meadowbrook Golf Course. And I feel like we're being sold an amorphous fear. You know, saying the word flood in Rapid City is like yelling fire in a crowded theater. We get panicky, and with good reason. But I just wonder if this is good reason here. I definitely think we need to get the long-term fix in place as soon as possible. But I just wonder, I know, and Mr. Ellis, I want to thank you for your good work on this and in presenting this, and I know you're just taking the reins, and a lot of these are problems you're inheriting that were never under your watch. But I feel like we're being sold fire alarms here. There may be a fire, and you may need that fire alarm, but do we know that? And I think it's important that we've been told we need to trust our engineer on this. And I would agree if that engineer had not bid the project with the possibility of doing the work that they recommended. I think what we have in front of us is an estimate. And not unlike if we took our car down to get an estimate for repairs or had somebody come over to give us an estimate on repairs on our house. We may question that. It may be an exactly correct estimate. But to say this is an engineering report or audit, I think is incorrect if the company presenting it had any contemplation of doing the work they were recommending. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just say we have to note that there is an inherent bias in that fear factor that's being presented to us. Now, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, Mr. Ellis, I noticed I jotted down a quote. One of the things you said early in your presentation was, if we don't fix this, eventually something, quote, something significant, end quote, will happen. You know, we don't know, and a significant happening might not involve any loss of human life. Am I not correct? I mean, that could involve just a partial deterioration of the spillway.
That's correct. I'm not saying that there would be loss of life, but there are other issues that you need to know about. That if the spillway did give, if the water moved its way through Rapid Creek, I mean the cleanup effort for that, all that sediment, all the trees that are going to get knocked down, all that, you know, there's going to be a measurable cost to cleaning that up. So you may not have a loss of life, you may not have structures that are demolished, but there will be a cost to cleaning that up.
If an event were to occur, and we don't think that's very likely at all, really, do we? It's just a possibility that we're looking out for, and that's just a fear that we're trying to alleviate without being able to measure. Okay. Among the options you presented, there was not an option presented of a partial drain of the lake, which Alderman Johnson got at. Can you address pros and cons on that one?
Mr. Ellis.
Certainly. In the winter, I think you can manage the flows coming in because you don't have precipitation. So if this were wintertime, I think you could pump the lake or you could drain the lake and effectively manage it. All bets are off in the spring and summer. You're talking a basin that is hundreds of square miles, or I don't know how many thousands of acres. If you get a half an inch of rain, you add that up for the entire basin, the volume of water that's going to come down to the lake, you can't pump that out fast enough. It will create a head over the top of that. And it may only last an hour or 2 hours, but your pumps can't keep up with it for those hour or two. So essentially what you're doing is you still have the high risk because the water's coming down, okay? You still got that large volume of water that you can't pump out. And then once the event's gone and the water starts subsiding, over the course of a day or 2 days, you could pump it down. But the risk is gone. The risk is when you get the event. And that's where the volume of water comes in. And that's why when I said I don't think it's manageable, you can't manage Mother Nature. You can't pump Mother Nature over that dam. The volume of water just can't be managed.
And that would be just on days of heavy rain during the summer.
And that is the biggest risk. Those are the highest risk days. And granted, it's just spring and summer, but that's the season we're approaching. If it was winter, I think we'd be coming forward with a different recommendation. I'd probably say it could be manageable, but.
Okay, let me go to the likelihood of the success of this fix that's being proposed. And Alderman Koiker already read from the report on page 9, subtask 2.3 sinkhole mitigation, subtask 2.3.1. The emergency effort would best be performed by draining the reservoir, cleaning out the sinkhole area, and installing a graded material, blah, blah, blah. As an alternative, sealing of the sinkhole could be attempted from a barge without draining the reservoir. although not expected to be as effective, it hopefully would improve the seepage conditions. So we're proposing the barge option, is that not correct?
Mr. Ellis?
Very similar to the barge. The gentleman that spoke earlier, he has a flotation device that goes out. It's connected to his truck. He can go out 300 yards and he can drop it. So not necessarily barge, but same type of an operation.
Okay, and we were originally considering an estimate of between 150 to 250,000, and I think that involved draining the lake. Am I wrong on that? I think that was the first option, cost estimate.
I don't-
Do we have an estimate for the new proposal of doing it from a flotation unit, or whatever you want to call it?
I think, Mr. Ellis, I can answer this. The question has already been asked and answered. It was roughly $100,000. And on top of that, you'd have about $38,000 worth of permitting and construction observation. Am I close there, Mr. Ellis? Okay, very
Okay.
good.
Now, my question gets at the fact that it's noted in the report that this would not be as an effective of an option. What is the likelihood of success of this fix? Or maybe it's a sliding scale. Maybe we can expect 85% success, which still alleviates 85% of the risk. Can you address that?
Mr. Ellis? There again, we may want to go back, and I think just for clarification for everyone in the audience, the alternative that was suggested in the report was basically dropping down large rock, then sand, and then bentonite on top. That is not the process that is being proposed tonight. Is that correct, Mr. Ellis?
It is the same process. The difference that Mr. Hurlbut is discussing is with
Pumping.
water in the lake or without water in the lake.
Okay, and well, let's back up. We can't pinpoint the sinkholes until we actually drop the bentonite and hope we hit it. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, but we know their general area. We know it isn't a large area encompassing the entire lake. It's an area perhaps the size of this room.
Okay. Do we have, and perhaps the HDR people could address this, do we have an estimate of the likelihood of us hitting our target with some measure of success?
I'll leave that answer to them.
In our proposal for the short-term fix, we had included divers as part of that proposal to help identify those locations. So if that answers your first question. The likelihood of the fix is directly proportional to what the divers say. If we can identify solid piping holes or sinkholes, I feel very comfortable. And if we apply enough bentonite over a large enough area, we will see some remedy. I can't stand up here today and say that with 100% certainty we're going to resolve this problem. I just can't do that. Given the lack of data that we had in the initial report, it's just not feasible.
Is there any possibility that this would exacerbate the problem?
And just for the record, there again, could you just identify yourself for the record, please?
I'm sorry, this is Mike Coleman, HDR Engineering.
Thank you, Mike.
There's always a potential that the drainage pathways could become plugged, but we don't see that as a large risk.
Okay. Mr. Ellis? As far as the modeling goes, you said you just don't know when you can expect the modeling to be done. Can you give us any kind of a ballpark on that? I mean, are we talking years or are we talking weeks? I think it's important to have that model in our hand before we spend $150,000 taxpayer dollars.
Mr. Ellis?
It's not years. It's probably weeks.
Okay, I guess I'm going to yield the floor, but I'm just going to say that I think we should do everything we can to expedite both the spillway reconstruction and the modeling process before we make this decision, if at all possible, is my instinct at this point. I appreciate all the information brought forward. I think draining the lake has obviously got so many cons to it that I don't think we should consider that. But we need better information to weigh this, I think, appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to, see, Ron Weifenbach has not spoken yet. Let's go to Ron Weifenbach.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have some comments. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Ellis for his PowerPoint presentation. This is something that, it helped me. I've made a lot of notes during and after our previous meeting with information regarding the spillway and some of the sinkholes and the boils and everything that we're talking about. And after listening tonight and trying to come to a conclusion, it's obvious that one of the things that when you come to make this decision as a city council person, whoever, our biggest concern is the risk for loss of life with doing nothing. Draining a lake, obviously, takes away the possibility of any loss of life. Tom Johnson alluded to the fact that when the flood happened in 1972, the spillway wasn't breached, it was the dam that was breached, and it was breached because of the debris that came and hit the dam and tore part of the dam apart and breached it, and which also was attributed to the wall of water that came down Rapid City. And I think it's important that we understand that I don't think that there's a possibility of this happening. I'm not an engineer, but looking at all the notes and reading back the history of Rapid City since I think it started, Rapid City was incorporated in 1885, but I think there's some things that went back to the 1860s about floodwaters and the rain that we get in Rapid City, and we are always going to see some sort of flooding in Rapid City, whether this spillway is in perfect condition, not perfect condition. Had this spillway been in perfect condition, I don't think that anybody's going to guarantee that that spillway would still not be breached. I mean, obviously, the dam could still be breached with heavy rains and things like that. So I think what we're trying to make a decision, and we're looking for someone out there to give us a guaranteed answer that says this is not going to happen. After listening to the fellow from Newell talking about dumping the bentonite into the holes, and I think that having the lake full maybe helps the hydraulic pressure to push that bentonite and sand and rock into those fissures that are part of the problem. Without that water being there, I don't think that there's any way that thing can be done. Looking at draining the lake, and you're looking at some of the pros and cons that are involved, I've made a list of them. The bypass is of the utmost importance for the fish downstream and for the anglers and everybody involved in that. That was a project we had online, making the bypass to allow the colder water. The environmental impacts of draining the lake are just tremendous. They're beyond probably what we can all sit up here and fathom. The costs, that's a big issue. The cost to rebuild the spillway is tremendous. It's probably going to, in some of the estimates I've seen, up to $4 million. And being on a council for almost a year now, I think that usually those estimates are higher. The quality of life for the people in the park area, the quality of life for the people of Rapid City, having that lake and having that park to be able to go do draining the lake and having the water come down, and we're going to get, it's in the springtime, we're going to get water filling it back up. I thought about the avenue of having the lake half full. I'm not sold that there's an imminent danger that spillway being breached or that dam being breached would cause any loss of life. I believe that since the 72 flood, there's been about 750 acres, if I'm somewhere in that ballpark, that have been designated green space or areas where buildings are not allowed. There may be some fences and things, but upstream from the dam, we've stopped building from happening upstream. This is the perfect example of why we've done that. So anybody who's looked at that, some of the building permits that we didn't allow happen in Dark Canyon are simply for these particular reasons. The structures are what caused the breach, not the water, not the hydraulic pressure. I think that the one thing that we're missing too, and Alderman Kroger alluded to it, was just some sort of a model that would say, hey, listen, if this spillway breached, what kind of loss of life would we be concerned about? I'm not really, buildings and those types of things, they're replaceable. That's not an issue for me. Making a decision, the biggest issue I have is a loss of life, but weighing out all the pros, and I think I could be comfortable moving forward with, trying to figure out a way to stop the immediate, imminent, and maybe putting some fixes in place. I think that the fellow from Newell put it good. It's if we could fill that bentonite in, and the hydraulic pressure from the water helps push it into those fissures and fills it up and stops the sinkholes and the downstream boils. I had concerns about how many sinkholes there were, but after listening to them and understanding the process of how maybe some divers can kind of identify some of those holes and fill them and put the pressure into those holes and fill them up. I think it's going to buy us some time to allow the bypass to be built, allow us time for some environmental impact studies, because we're obviously going to dredge that lake. We've been thinking about that for a long time. We're obviously going to build the bypass, and we obviously need money to fix that spillway. And I think that I believe there was a few of my colleagues that went to Washington, D.C. and actually had a meeting with Senator Thune and Johnson and Herseth and addressed some of the problems that Rapid City faces with this spillway. They gave them a PowerPoint presentation. I think if there's only one thing that would be lacking here would be the modeling of what would happen. I just out of the information I have and the research that I've done, I don't think there's any more significant danger of this being breached versus having a big wall of water come down dark canyons. So I'm comfortable with moving forward with some fixes to allow these other things to happen in a methodical, well planned out, and allow for the seismic studying of how we're going to replace this spillway and those types of things. So with those comments, I'd like to thank Mr. Ellis. I know we got you under the gun and we're throwing a few rocks at you, but you've done a great job, and I think we really made the right decision when we put you in that position. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. We still have some more lights. I think everyone has spoke once, so we can go to the top of the order. Alderman Karen Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In reference to an earlier discussion about some seismic testing, I noticed under the long-term preliminary investigation, some boring is planned. And is the intent of that some of the same purpose that might happen from some kind of seismic registration to determine what it is that's under the dam?
Very similar. Different tests, similar results, just trying to find out exactly what's underground, what conditions it in.
And the question several people, both Mr. Kroger and Mr. Hurlbut, have alluded to the fact of some modeling. My understanding, and I can't find it in the report, that there's probably about 160 cubic acres of water in the dam in the reservoir as it stands now.
That is correct.
And so when I'm listening to the modeling question, what it says to me is, do we have space downstream to accommodate that amount of water should the necessity arise that we would need to have that storage capacity below the dam? And that was, I think, the question I was asking in regard to the Greenway, which is, I think, essentially the same as what Ron and Mr. Hurlbut are asking for. So so my assumption is we do have some measurements even now of our carrying capacity. Mr. Weifenbach alluded to those as well, below the dam. And that would do, kind of wandering around the tree here. I guess my assumption in listening, asking for modeling is that do we have capacity throughout the city to hold those additional acre feet of water?
Mr. Ellis?
Without modeling, then I can't answer that question.
Okay. Karen, anything else? No. Very good. Let's see. Let's go back to Alderman Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I have some comments, and I have maybe a direction I think that the council should consider taking. First of all, I believe that we probably should have had this lake dived already. We should know where those holes are before we actually send out for an emergency. I think that would have been important. If we have identified where their basic area is, I think that would lend better to maybe the cost of even this temporary fix. That's number one. Number two is, I'm not sure the experience HDR has in this particular thing. I was somewhat disappointed that we have somebody right in the area that has other techniques that were not considered, and I think that was somewhat disappointing as far as I go. I believe from this point, before the council really takes any significant action, I think we need to do the modeling to find out what risk there actually is. Will our floodway actually contain a failure at Canyon Lake. And remember, there are a number of failures that could occur. It could be a total failure. It could be a partial failure. Would that be contained within the floodway with only 20% of the water now that is there? And secondly, we need to find out if we can actually drain that lake without pumping it through the alternative method that Robert had talked about, the gate that had not been open for several years. I think we need to determine if that's an alternative. I would say that it does not concern me if we do let the lake down to a 50% level or some level that makes some sense, that we have some rain and it fills back up, because I believe within a couple of days you can draw it back down in the same fashion. Right now the lake is full and it isn't breaking. Tomorrow it's probably not going to break either. So you only have less risk, you minimize that amount of risk. Thirdly, I believe we have some control over Pactola based upon some federal legislation that I think that we can also impact what actually comes into the lake. So I believe we need to get modeling done. I believe that we need to find out if that gate is working and get some recommendation from that. I believe that we could actually send this to the 2012 committee for some consideration of total funding to actually get the thing done right, which I think is fairly important. We have an annual meeting coming up here at the end of the month. One of the things that struck me just from this report was in Section B in the purpose here, it says the Canyon Lake Dam in the city of Rapid City has been experiencing seepaging issues for the past 30 years. We're talking about fixing the seepage issue. If you look at the last half sentence in here, but the issue still remains and reemerged as a priority with a new leak has materialized in the face of the spillway. That seems to be the danger, not the seepage. So if we do a temporary fix, we are not actually addressing what I think this report says the danger is. The danger is still the leak on the spillway. So we might make ourselves feel good, but we may not accomplish anything. I don't see that the council is ready to act tonight. I won't make a motion, but I'm going to tell you what I think we ought to do. I think we ought to send this to 2012 for consideration of getting the dam fixed in its entirety, number one. And number two, I think that the staff should be directed to bring back the information regarding modeling and the ability to draw that lake down without the use of pumping, and an option that also would consider maybe a reduction in level of that lake. But that's what I would recommend. I won't make a motion before it's premature, but I think the council is kind of looking for somewhere to go. That would be my recommendation, and I'll listen to what else the council has. If nobody offers something, that's what I'll be offering later. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, just for clarification, I want to make sure everybody in the audience understands this. I was under the impression that by doing the temporary fixes, it would address both the seepage underneath and the rooster tail. Did I miss something there?
No, that's correct.
Okay, it would address both. Okay, very good. Alderman Malcolm Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've tried to distill all of the information, and I guess the most important information for me is the recommendation that's coming out of our Public Works Department after interfacing with HDR on this. And let me just start off my comments by saying that well, without a doubt, safety is paramount, and I think that's the place that everyone's trying to get to. From what I've heard tonight, it seems to be less of a hazard today than the hazard that was experienced in 1972 because of, in large part, some of the improvements with the Greenway and not allowing building permits and some of those things to take place in that core area that was flooded out in 1972. As a result of that, I don't understand the importance of modeling information as it relates to fixing the sinkholes. I think they're two different things. I think we can get modeling information if that's what the council desires. I don't see how that has anything to do whatsoever with fixing the sinkholes. I guess I'm lost if we know automatically that there's 20% of the water that potentially could come through through the spillway, that the improvements that have been done with the Greenway. I'm trying to figure out what are we looking to gain with the modeling that would impact fixing the sinkholes. I guess I don't understand that. Having said that, I am ready to act, and I will make a motion based on the request, the authorization for the mayor and finance officer to sign a professional services agreement, as well as the recommendations that were made by our public works director. That would be my motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. I'm going to just, for clarification, we'll restate that the motion is to include authorization for the mayor and the finance officer to sign a professional service agreement with HDR for a total amount of $38,120, and to authorize the staff to go out and proceed with the temporary fixes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Robert, are you?
I might recommend declaring that as an emergency so that we can get that corrected as soon as possible.
Okay. Is that okay? Is that all right with the seconder? Is that all right with the seconder? Karen? Is that all right with the seconder? The recommendation from the Public Works Director was to also declare it an emergency so they could start on the temporary fixes.
The seconder is fine with that.
Okay, very good. Any further discussion? If not, we do have another light on. Alderman Chapman, are you still have the floor, sir, if you wish?
I know I've already made a motion, but I guess I would like for our public works director to address that concern. It seems as if we're getting bogged down here around this modeling software or potential to be able to model. I don't disagree that could be very important to our community. I don't discount that at all. I think there could be great value in that. I just don't see the connection between the modeling software and the sinkholes at this point, or what's being asked of the council tonight. If there's a connection between the two that I'm missing, that we shouldn't move forward until we get modeling software, that's not clear to me as to why. And I'd like some clarification of that.
Very good.
I tend to agree. If the dam were to breach, it's a disaster downstream. It's not going to be the size of disaster we've seen in the past, but it will be a disaster. There's going to be a major cleanup effort. There's going to be a loss in credibility of city government to protect the public, and that's why I feel that this is an emergency, because a dam breaching, large or small, is a dam breaching, and that sends fear through the community. And I think it's important that we recognize there's an issue. We should address it. The modeling is going to show you there's going to be disaster downstream. It'll give you the limits of it, but I can guarantee you there will be a mess downstream to clean up. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Alderman Deb Hadcock.
I think you've done a good job on this, Robert. I think it is an emergency. I think we have recognized it is an issue, but I think the fix of how we're doing the bentonite and the things we're doing with the bypass, I think that's all good. I think you've done a great job on that. But I'm trying to look at the big picture. How are you fixing something if you don't know what it looks like? It kind of reminds me of doing an x-ray or not doing an x-ray and going in to fix something without that x-ray.
Okay, let's go to Robert Ellis.
Just to clarify the process, the actual motion that's on the floor, it's first to enter into a professional services agreement with HDR so they can study it more. They did a very preliminary, honestly, it was a $10,000 study, the initial study that they provided. This was a $10,000 study. The motion on the floor is to allow them to look into it, to give us a set of plans that we can build, to identify exactly what the problem is, what the extent of the problem is. That's what HDR will do. They will provide for us a plan to reconstruct or to fix that sinkhole. They don't know right now because they haven't done those services, and it wouldn't be fair to ask them to go do that, and we'll pay you later depending on the results.
But Robert, we're doing a temporary fix the same way. He's going to go in, blow those holes, and I understand what you're doing. It's like caulking or filling in the holes with plaster or whatever you want to use, but you have to blow it in, and you need the water for the hydraulics. I've got everything down in that sense, and it's a great idea. But again, I guess with common sense, to me, it seems like you'd have a cross-section of the geological area, knowing what's underneath before he blows it, before you reconstruct it, not when you're going to reconstruct it. I think he would probably be better off if he knew what was underneath and where he exactly needs to blow it, just by seeing the cross sections geologically on it. Go ahead, Robert.
Robert?
What HDR will do is they will bring a plan back to the city and say, this is our recommendation for fixing it. Now that we've analyzed it more, now that we've had better exploration, we've done the diving, we think we know what needs to be done. The next step will be, I hate to say this, we might not even do work with the gentleman that stepped
But
forward.
Robert, last time when they did that, they did boring and things like that. I guess I'm wanting to know, how are they geologically going to see what is underneath the lake? Are they going to bore like last time, like every foot, every 2 foot? I mean, how are they going to see that? Are they doing a seismic profile? What are they going to do in order to see what we need to do, Robert? Instead of find out later that it's 38,000, but we got to add another 38,000 because we need to do this now.
Robert?
I don't believe that seismic analysis is part of the services that they're providing. I don't know exactly what actual steps that they're going to go through in coming forward with that design, and that's essentially why we're hiring them, to do what needs to be done and tell us what needs to be done.
Well, I guess that's my problem. Everything you've said is awesome. How they're doing it, the process in which they're doing it. My whole thing is, and I'll keep saying this, how do we know what we're doing until we see what's underneath? And how do we see underneath? If we have to do seismic profiling, if they have a different process in which, in order to see that bedrock, limestone bedrock, is not all in that the basin area or the dirt area, if it's not all holy. I guess I'm wanting to see what's underneath, and I guess that pertains to the cost of what it's going to cost in the end as well, or if the thing's going to fail beforehand, or how much bentonite's going to go into it. Doesn't that solve a lot of the issues of what we need to do?
Robert, did you have a response?
I don't, because we don't have an agreement with this firm over here. They have no obligations to provide us that design service, and we can't ask them to provide it if we're not going to pay them for it. So it puts us in the situation where we'd like to hire them to take a closer look at it. But
Okay, so what I'm saying is maybe we ought to put that and ask them if that's part of their 38,000. And if it's not, I guess I would want that part of the cost of this project.
Can you help us out just a little bit? Can you restate your question, please?
To see what's underneath this lake. How do we figure out what's underneath the lake without doing bore samples or, I mean,
Okay.
how are you going to figure out geologically what's underneath, where's the sinkholes, where to fix, where to do the bypass without seeing the geological subsections of this lake?
Okay. Let me see if I can restate the question. Is there anything specific in what you're proposing that would allow you to take a look at what's underneath the dam and also at the bypass, or is the professional service agreement strictly to propose a plan to fix the temporary leaks? I think that's where you're headed. Is that correct, Deb?
Yep.
Okay.
Mike Coleman, HDR Engineering. Our proposal does not have any geotechnical services provided in it. The difficulty of doing geotechnical services in the wet is high. In a previous study that was done, we reviewed the literature, and a seismic survey was recommended at that point, but given the difficulties of doing a seismic survey in the wet, it was stopped at that time, so we no longer pursued it based on the results of the literature review.
Okay.
In the wet meaning
Why
in water?
why the reservoir is full.
Okay, because the people that I have the information on, actually they drill wells and that do the seismic profiling on the one that I'm speaking of, so it is in water. They use it for finding aquifers and wells, and also use it for drilling. Again, I'm looking at the x-ray part. How do you fix it without the x-ray? So I guess, what is your plan? Are you going to, in order to show this guy, is it just going to be where the sinkhole is? How are you going to figure out where to put the bentonite and where it starts? Once he finds the hole or finds the specific hole, I understand that it'll go and blow in everywhere that there's holes in it, if I'm correct. But again, how are you going to figure that out?
Mike, I think the question is what is basically the scope of your proposed professional service agreement? If you could just cover that, I think that's what she's asking.
Okay, in large part, our scope covers a mitigation measure that will apply bentonite to the area we believe is leaking. The leaking area was identified by that dye test in the photograph, and we're relying on previously provided data in order to provide our area of application of the bentonite.
Do you know if this area has ever been geologically having any pictures of it, underground geology or anything of this lake?
The only geotechnical data we have to date is from the original dam reconstruction on the 1976 plans, and we've used that data to formulate our educated opinion of where the lake is, or where the leaking area, the leaking zone is.
Go ahead.
We've further, in our approach, we're talking somewhat of a shotgun approach to place that in a larger area, and that was included in our approach, is to get enough bentonite, 2 to 5 pounds per square feet in an approximate location, and we're going to have to keep working until we find it, or if we don't, we're going to have to stop.
I guess, again, and then that's my issue. Basically, civilly, we'll take care of it in a civil engineer sense, again, but geologically, underneath, we don't know what we're dealing with. So, again, I'm trying to figure out how you're going to fix something if you don't know what it looks like.
Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Anything else, Deb?
Nope.
Okay, very good. Let's go to Alderman Ron Croker. Please keep in mind we do have a motion on the floor. Alderman Ron Croker.
Thank you, Mayor. I just kind of want to address Alderman Chapman's question regarding why I would like to have the modeling done. I guess the concern I have is, number one, this has been leaking for 30 years. There's been a heck of a lot of water that's leaked through that. My biggest concern is if we plug the holes and we create that extra pressure on that spillway, that over the years it might have had damage to it. I don't know that. I guess no one really knows that, if that's the case or not. But my concern is if we do that and we go into design stage to replace the dam and we think, okay, everything's hunky-dory, it doesn't have a rooster tail anymore, it's not leaking, everything's fine. We go through the procedure and it takes a year to do it, and the cost is $4 million, and all of a sudden this council says, well, you know, we don't really have $4 million, but we got 2012 coming up here in another year or two, we can do it at that point in time. And so we kind of think that the fix has taken place and there is a failure of that dam. My concern is I really believe, I mean, I was here during the 72 flood, and I know there was, in some places there was 15 inches of rain, and I think Rapid Creek and Cleghorn Canyon was 15 foot out of its banks. There was one heck of a lot of water that come down there. Well, that's not going to happen again, but my concern is if that spillway gives way, you know, I really believe by the time the water that's in there today is, I really believe that by the time it gets through the golf course and meanders its way towards Bacon Park, that it's actually going to probably be back in the creek banks again, or a little bit over. But my concern is there's some person at Canyon Lake or at Bacon Park, if that was to break and it's putting, I want to say garbage, but it's, they're at the grocery store and they got groceries that they're putting in their car, and that breaks and it washes them in ways that kills them. I mean, we had a false pretense that this was all fixed. Modeling will tell us basically where that water is going to dispense at what point down the creek, and would eliminate us a concern of loss of life if it was to break. That's my concern, because, I mean, 30 years of leakage to plug the hole, you know, who knows what damage has been done to that, and I don't know if plugging the hole is going to fix the problem.
Very good. Let's go to Joel Ladine, our Assistant City Attorney.
Thank you, Mayor. This is probably fairly obvious, but I think it needs to be said. Obviously, you've been given recommendations. If something were to happen, however unlikely it may be, and the council is not to have taken any action at the time it happened, there's obviously going to be significant liability on the part of the city, especially considering if the dam does break, even though there is a greenway and a lot of changes in Rapid City since 1972, and everyone doesn't dispute that it would probably be less of an issue than before. I think it's highly likely that there's going to be significant property damage and that there is a potential for injury and loss of life. We're talking about $100,000 tonight, and I think it's important you keep in mind we had a road through the park, and one teenage boy was put in a permanent vegetative state for the rest of his life, and he got a $6 million judgment. Well, if 3 or 4 people are severely injured and there's significant property damage, think about how much money you're probably talking at this point. You're talking about much more than even the cost of the dam is going to be. And I just think it's important that the council, when it weighs its decision tonight, think about the potential liability, even though it may be unlikely, if something were to occur and the council doesn't take any action. All your actions, if the dam breaks, more than likely the city is going to end up in court one way or another, no matter what you do. But the more that you do to give us in court, the better off the city is going to be in the long run from a liability perspective.
Okay, thank you. I do have a number of lights here, and I'm going to try and sort through this. A number of folks have already spoken at least twice, so I'm going to try and go to. I know. I'm going to try and give some folks that really haven't had the opportunity to speak much the opportunity first, and then we'll come back through the cycle. So, is it a point of order? Okay, point of order then. Go ahead, Malcolm.
I agree with what Alderman Johnson is saying. We did have a lot of conversation prior to this, and I think people spoke a couple of times. But there's a motion on the floor, and I think we reset that entire calendar. I mean, to have people speak.
Actually,
again
there
to
was
the
no motion. There was no motion on the floor at all. So we're basically at the original motion. So therefore, and I'm going to look to Joel. We don't have a change in motion, so therefore we don't reset. So I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to speak. But there's been a number of folks that have had plenty of opportunity to speak. I think it's only fair that we go to some folks that haven't had as much opportunity. We'll come through and everyone will have as much time. This is an important issue. We will take all
Point of order,
comments.
Mayor. Point of order.
Go ahead, please.
I disagree with your interpretation. There
Okay.
was, the original motion was just placed by Alderman Chapman. There was not a motion before. I believe that our council rules calls for a different motion or a motion being placed, that it does reset the clock, that you do take people in order. And I'm not arguing that for my behalf because I'm 4 of 5. It doesn't move me up, but I believe that in order to be consistent, I believe that you must now start the clock all over and take the lights in order. And I would appeal to our parliamentarian if you disagree.
Very good. If we want to spend the next half an hour and argue about that, that's fine. But unless you want to make a motion to challenge the ruling of the chair, we'll move on. Is that your desire, Alderman Johnson?
I'd appeal to the parliamentarian then.
No, the motion was you would need to appeal the motion of the chair. That would be your motion. Otherwise, the determination of the chair will stand and we'll move on.
Is that what the proper format is? I'd ask the city attorney.
I think it's a stretch to call myself a parliamentarian. However, I think that the mayor is correct that there was a single motion laid. There has not been a new motion. I would also point out that the mayor is the chair of the meeting, and I believe it's up to the chair of the meeting to rule on whether or not a motion is out of order. He has made a ruling. He is probably within his discretion to do so.
I would move to appeal the decision of the chairman.
Okay, is there a second, please? Is there a second? Okay, we have a second. Now, just so everybody is clear, the only discussion that can be had is the determination of the chair. In other words, there will be no discussion whatsoever as far as the original motion. Discussion will only be on parliamentary procedure. Is everyone clear on that? With that, Jackie, please clear the lights if you would, please. Take everybody off the board. Thank you. Now, discussion on the motion on the floor, which is the appeal, basically, of point of order. Any discussion on that motion? Very good. Alderman Malcolm Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My concern was that everyone had an opportunity to speak again for a second time. I think what we're saying is the same thing. You were just going to give voice to those folks so that hadn't spoke an opportunity maybe to speak first, but you didn't say that people on the board would not be allowed to speak. I'm not sure how we need to dispose of this item, and maybe I will look to the city attorney for some direction in that. I think everyone will get an opportunity to speak, and everyone will have to be able to speak twice or 3 times or what have you. So I guess I'm looking for some direction in terms of how do we dispose of the item that has been brought to the floor.
Very good. Let's go, that was a question for our city attorney, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's go to our city attorney.
Thank you, Mayor. Obviously, you take a vote on the motion. I mean, it's at that point, an affirmative vote. I'm trying to think of the way it was
I don't see any lights. I call the question.
appeal the decision, so it's not really specified, though, what a vote for appealing the decision. Never mind.
Okay. The question's been called. Was there a second? Second. Any objection to calling the question? Any question? We will take a vote on calling the question. Yes, we are testing my parliamentary procedures. Okay, all those in favor of calling the question signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Now we're back to the appeal of the motion, or the appeal of the ruling of the chair. And we go immediately to that motion. All those voting in favor of overriding the decision, determination of the chair, signify by saying aye. Opposed?
No.
Roll call, please.
LaCroy,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Adcock? No. Hurlbut,
Aye.
Batman,
No.
Orphenbach,
No.
Olson. Kroger. Quaker.
Aye.
5-4.
That's
Motion-
correct.
Motion fails on a 5-4 vote. So, please bring the lights up again. That was an interesting exercise that brought us back to square one. So, at this point, if you have any further discussions, please turn your lights on. And if those folks that have spoken twice would like to speak for a third time, the council can waive that recommendation with a vote of the council. And the chair would look for motion which would allow discussion more than twice on a single issue. If that's, there again, I stated earlier, my intent was to allow everyone to have full discussion on this issue, so if there is that motion, we can certainly do that. Very good. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, the motion and a second on the floor is to suspend the rules and allow for, do you want to say for 3 or unlimited debate? I'm sorry? Unlimited debate. Very good. Any discussion on that motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, everyone. Now we can continue, and there again, what I will try and do is, as we go through, since there is unlimited, we will take the lights in order, regardless of how many times anyone has spoken. Is everyone clear on that? Very good. Let's go to Alderman Malcolm Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that it seems to me that at some core level, the council is in agreement that, we've got an issue and something needs to be done. I'm not sure how we get there. I guess I put a motion on the floor so that we could vote on something or have some discussion about something that was actually a motion and not just have discussion. That's why I put the motion on the floor. I would ask those that disagree with that motion, what is it that they propose that we do tonight? Or what is it that they propose that we do with the recommendation that's been given to us by our Public Works Department, so that we can move off of the place that we are now and move on to something that's meaningful in terms of getting something done with the spillway. And that's just a question for the floor.
Okay, very good. Additional questions or comments? Let's go to Alderman Karen Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm in support of the motion on the floor because I believe that our professional staff have brought something forward that makes sense in terms of providing public safety, providing not a long-term, but a relatively sensible calendar of how we move forward. My understanding is we're being asked this evening to take care of the sinkholes. I have heard my colleagues who are concerned, do we know enough information about the position of those sinkholes? And it seems to me that based on their engineering advice and the dye testing plus the diving that has taken place, that we do have enough information about that in a positive way we can move forward and solve the sinkhole problem, which then enables us to have time to move forward with the larger issue of rebuilding the spillway. In the proposal as it currently stands under the long-term preliminary investigation, boring was a part of that proposal. I certainly would be open to the idea of some kind of seismic testing if that seems appropriate, and obviously our engineers have put that forward. But it seems to me that what we're being asked tonight is allows sufficient information as presented by both our city engineers and those who have a great deal of expertise on this matter to allow us to move forward with that particular proposal, which then, my understanding is, they will then do the additional work that gives us a more precise estimate of costs and ensures that we are actively moving forward in solving a problem that I see as of concern to everyone on this council. No one is,
It's not a motion.
no one really is opposed. Everyone up here is concerned about public safety. And I think it is a matter of how we arrive at the place where we best can serve the purposes of making our community safe. And I think this is the motion on the floor provides us a first step in putting together the information and in a practical way creating a document that will then allow us to move forward with the immediate solution, then allowing us time to take a look at the long-term investigations. In terms of addressing modeling, it's my understanding that there is sufficient space below the dam for the water, but I think that Mr. Ellis speaks correctly when he talks about the fact that this would be certainly a serious problem to the community that would require considerable reconstruction, major cleanup, elements that would be of concern to our community. So I'm supporting the motion on the floor, and I believe it includes the declaring an emergency where thus we're able to move forward quickly, because I think this is a serious issue that everyone in our community needs to know that we as the governing body are looking at and moving forward in a way that ensures public safety and also ensures that the long-term interests of the city in terms of fiscal responsibility are also maintained. Thank you.
Let's go to Alderman Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to offer a substitute motion in just a moment here. I wanted to address the city attorney's recommendation in consideration that we may have some risk and we may get sued. I think if really the city wanted to eliminate the risk, we'd have to eliminate the high hazard dam. We're moving forward and we have a high hazard dam and we continue to let that happen. That in of itself, I think, puts us in a position where we could get sued. You know, just based on that. So I think you need to measure what you have in the suit. I believe that a good strategy is to consider drawing the dam down, reducing the water level, reducing the risk to the public, which I believe we can do if you can open a gate. And I believe you can do it through pumping as well. I also believe that you ought to spend the taxpayers' money wisely. What we have on the table here is an option to spend $150,000 to $250,000, which is $250,000 for a temporary fix, and you have to do it again. You start all over. We also heard from our city engineer tonight that it was possible we might be able to do the permanent fix later this fall. If I can reduce the risk to the public and also use the taxpayers' dollars wisely, that's the option that I'm going to take. And that's why I believe that I would not vote on this tonight. I believe that you can reduce the risk and also spend the money more wisely. I did have one question based upon that last slide that was up, and this will be a technical question either through HDR or for the city engineer. if there would be a dam failure, what would we expect to actually fail? Would it be the concrete part, or would it be the, is that the clay base you refer to? Considering there's 140 acre-feet of water in that reservoir, would you expect the entire amount to go?
Mr. Ellis?
I think the greatest threat would be a failure of this right here, and the water would come through that direction, is my opinion.
The reason why I asked that, and I'm not up there to draw, and it's one of the reasons why I'd kind of like to see a different format for the council as well, but if you were to wipe out that entire concrete barrier and the clay base, you'd have 180 or 140 acre-feet of water. Just based upon what the city engineer said, I don't think you wouldn't totally take all the water at once out of that lake, even if you did have a catastrophic explosion, I guess, that happened there. So from the get-go, even with that lake 140 acre-feet deep, it's unlikely that you'd drop 180, 140 acre-feet, which again is 20% of what we had in flood. I don't see the imminent risk, especially if you draw that down. I'm going to make a substitute motion that we take this discussion to the 2012 committee for funding. That's full funding to fix this thing. And to direct the staff to bring back to council information regarding the ability to draw the lake down with the gate and modeling regarding on how the hydrology would work if there is a failure to the spillway. That's my substitute motion.
Okay, we have these. Yeah, we'll repeat it here in a second. We have a substitute motion and a second to send this to 2012, have staff investigate whether or not the gate is operational, and help me out here, Alderman Johnson. Was there a third part to that motion?
Third part would be to ask for modeling regarding the failure of the dam.
Okay, very good. Those are the three parts. So send to 2012, the gate, functionality of the gate, and also the modeling. And we have a motion and a second. Okay, everyone clear on that? So there again, we have a substitute motion. Further discussion on the substitute motion, if we could. Alderman Quaker, did you want to talk on the substitute motion? Very good. Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. I have several comments relating to that motion. First of all, I'm not sure that unless other projects are going to be moved or removed from the 2012 list, I'm not sure what would be available in 2012. The 2012 funds have been bonded out to 2014. There are some funds available, but those are already designated, in my understanding, for other projects. So I believe that the funding is very limited. Relating to the city attorney's comments earlier, and I believe that I'm speaking to the motion when I address those comments, because he expressed some concern about the council not proceeding with the first motion. Here's my question for our assistant city attorney. It appears now from the information available that the situation may not be as dire as the original report indicated. However, the report is indeed on the record, and it does state that the dam is in danger of failure with a possible loss of life, and there's no way to predict when failure would occur. And it further states that HDR's recommended course of immediate action is to drain the reservoir to repair the sinkholes pursuant to subtask 2.3 on page 9 of the report. If we proceed with either this motion or the previous motion, either modeling or proceeding with the other option of the barge option of putting in the matter to try to plug the hole, either way it appears that we're still not following HDR's recommendation. So in your legal opinion, what is the prudent thing for the council to do?
Let's go to Joel Lundeen, our assistant city attorney.
Thank you, Mayor. I was not trying to advocate a specific, I guess, solution. Obviously, that's within the council's discretion. What I was saying was that if you don't take any action and something were to happen, that you're going to have significant liability. Obviously, anything you do, we would use to defend the city and argue that we didn't have liability. My understanding is that HDR, in looking at all the factors, has made a change in the recommendation and is supporting what is being advocated in that position. The more you do closer to what your experts are recommending, probably the better off you are from a legal liability perspective. Now, Alderman Johnson's also correct. From a liability perspective, completely removing the dam and not having it there would probably completely remove the liability. But obviously the council also has other considerations, things like the DNR, the pollution to the creek, the smell, those other things that have to be weighed against the risk. Certain council members, it seems, are weighing the risk and saying because of the floodplain and things like that, and they're correct. The risk is less, but there's still risk as long as you have the dam there. As you pointed out, we have a report that says there's a risk for human, damage to property and a risk of human life if the dam were to break. From a liability perspective, some action is better than no action. The closer you do to what your experts are recommending, probably the better you are off from a liability perspective.
Thank you. We're giving, just for everyone's information, we're giving what I would call grand latitude in tonight's discussion, and we'll continue to do so. But there again, like I say, I would just, if we could, try and keep it somewhat in resemblance of the motion on the floor. With that, we go back to Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. The latitude was part of the original intent of my motion to suspend the rules. So, thank you. Relating to the, to the comments made by Joel, and I appreciate the comments. I guess I'd like to address a couple of other things relating to that, because the motion also includes requests for modeling relating to the zoning that we already do in the city every day. We have 100 and 500 year models. I believe we do in FEMA. Either those are FEMA's models or we have our own and FEMA has their own, but we do have 100 and 500 year. I'm not sure how a breach would be classified in that. It might be outside of that or it might be somewhere in that time frame, but we do have somewhat of a baseline in terms of modeling for a catastrophic event along the floodway or along the creek. Is that correct, Robert? Could you speak to that? And I have a couple other questions.
Robert Ellis.
That is correct. We do have the delineation of the 100-year and 500-year floodplain. I wouldn't be able to tell you if this was breached where that would fit, 50-year, 75-year, 100-year. That information I do not know.
Okay. Alderman Quaker, you still have the floor, sir.
I would like to have that information provided, and that may provide the answer to Alderman Johnson's question as well.
I think that was actually part of the motion.
Is it?
Alderman Johnson, his substitute motion was asking for modeling, so that isn't.
Okay, but it's important to know we do have some available, so it wouldn't be a matter of, probably wouldn't be a matter of reinventing the wheel. Here's my concern. It appears that HDR has changed their official recommendation. That's my understanding now at this point. That is not the report that we've been given in writing to the city council. I would ask the motion maker if he would be willing to accept a friendly amendment to ask that HDR amend their recommendation at no additional cost to the city, and to also accommodate the information on the other option that was provided by relating to the gentleman who testified earlier from Wyoming regarding the other option that might be available as well. I don't find it very comforting that HDR apparently wasn't aware or didn't include the information regarding the technology brought forth from this gentleman in Wyoming who had some good testimony. I'm not trying to be critical of HDR. I'm just simply saying is that the report needs to be amended to reflect the totality of the recommendation that we are now being given, and I think that that's important to do. So I guess I would ask the motion maker if he'd be willing to accept a friendly amendment to ask that official recommendation be, updated to reflect their new recommendation.
Okay, so we will ask the question. Actually, I think the proper procedure here is to actually make a motion to amend the substitute motion. Is that correct, Joel? I mean, we can do it one of two ways. We can either just ask the question, or we can actually vote on the amendment. Which?
It seems to me that there's an addition to there, out of the, 3 or 4 criteria that Alderman Johnson had in the original motion, they're adding an additional criteria or two to require HDR. So whether that's considered the same motion, it seems to me that it's a different motion because something different is being added to it. So it would be a new motion.
So it would be a second substitute motion. Oh. Okay. What the chair will do is, since there is, the original motion maker is acceptable to the amendment, we will accept that as a friendly amendment to the motion. Okay? Everyone clear on that? And the friendly amendment was to ask HDR if they'd be willing to revise their plan or their report to include the alternative recommendation as presented by the Public Works Department tonight. Is that correct, Alderman Quaker?
That's close. It's my understanding that HDR changed the recommendation, and I'm per the city attorney's comments, and I'm asking that the recommendation be updated accordingly.
Okay. I'm going to go to Robert Ellis because I'm reading the recommendation. It's actually their alternative. It's actually included in the report. Is that correct, Mr. Ellis?
That's my understanding.
Okay. So the proposed fix that's coming forward from the Public Works Department is included in the report, but it is the alternate, not the original recommendation. So with that, Alderman Quaker, you have the floor, sir.
So either way, it seems that we're proceeding with the Plan B. I think that's important to know, because Joel made some very good comments earlier, and regardless of which motion passes, we're not following the original recommendations of HDR. So can we theoretically sit up here on the dais and say which motion on the floor is better or worse than another if all the motions that are on the floor and have been considered tonight, every single one of them deviates from the original recommendation of the expert?
I think I can answer that. There were two recommendations. The primary recommendation was to basically take the lake down, basically fill it in, but it also specifically states on page 9, as has been pointed out in 3.21, as an alternate, sealing of the sinkhole could be attempted from a large barge. So I mean, that typically when you have reports like that, you can have the main recommendation, but you can also have alternates, which quite honestly I think the council deals with quite often when we're given options about how to deal with an issue. So I think we're all right there, Sam. But I mean, I'm going to leave it to your discretion.
Thank you, Mayor. It just simply says, although that option, the barge option, it specifically says is although not expected to be as effective, it hopefully would improve the seepage conditions. We're going to spend $250,000 on a hopefully when we know that we have an option A, which was the recommended option by the consultant, and if we have a breach between now and then, we have our city attorney and the report on record as indicating we didn't follow through with the option that was recommended by the consultant. That was the primary option. I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Robert Ellis.
Thank you, Mayor. In visiting with HDR, they'd be willing to amend this report to identify both of those options as equally opportune in solving the situation, if that helps with the motion.
Okay, very good. Let's go to Alderman Bob Hurlbut, please.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to start by thanking you for the latitude that you have given tonight and were giving before there was a motion to that effect. I appreciate that, and I think everybody does. It's an important issue that everybody be heard on. Very briefly, I just want to, in support of this motion, I want to point out that I am not convinced that the threat is sufficiently immediate, as in this week immediate, to not allow 1 or 2 weeks for 2012 funding discussion, and I think it is important that we consider whether this need, not just for the quick fix, but for the real fix, may have implications across our budget citywide, which may mean we may have to look at whether some of our important but more glamorous projects have to take a back seat to public safety here. And I think we need to at least have that discussion. And our meeting is this coming Monday, so it's not even, 6 days delay. And then at the subsequent council meeting, we can be provided with simple information on whether those gates can open and the modeling. My hope is that within 2 weeks, we can expedite and get that modeling to be able to be presented at the next council meeting. And this is just not a significant delay for a very significant issue. And I just think it's important to have that information, and I think that 2 weeks is not too much to ask to get the information we need to make a responsible decision here. My last point is, I notice we've had a speaker request form up here for some time, and I would ask my colleagues on the council. Dan Michael has a speaker request form here, and I'd like to hear from him. I would ask my colleagues, I guess, I don't know if I need to make that a motion or...
Why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and go through the rest of the lights up here. Just for the sake of clarity, typically at special council meetings, we do not allow anything additional on the agenda. There was nothing published as far as public comment. And so in order to take public comment, the council will there again have to basically waive the rules to allow that. If we may, let's go through all the lights and then we'll come back and we'll ask a question. Very good. Let's go to Alderman Deb Hadcock.
Wow, this became quite the issue. I have to agree at this point with some of my colleagues that said that professionals that do this for a living know best. I don't mind questioning or trying to find other alternatives with people, but we're getting out of hand here with modeling. I understand we need to do modeling, and that's a good thing, and that could be added to this. The 2012 issue, the gate with the water. I mean, we're just adding all kinds of things. We're just becoming opinionated instead of factual. What they're talking about kind of clarified it for me when the guy with the bentonite has done this before in other areas. That kind of clarified that the bentonite going into the seep holes and how it was going in kind of made me understand this a little bit better. If we do it from a barge, if we're going to drain it, I guess they'll figure that out at this point. What is best, if it needs to be 2 feet, 1 foot, maybe we should guess that tonight. Long story short, we should go with the first process of, again, I still have an issue. The only issue I have is the profiling or whatever you call it of the area, and that's the only thing I was going to add, was to kind of see that instead of doing the contract tonight, adding something to do with that to that contract that kind of shows us basically geologically what that area is doing in order to make both these studies work effectively. But when we're adding 2012 projects, it looks like we're just becoming opinionated of what we should do next. I think Robert's got it down. If we need to add any things with stipulations to some of that, add that to that, get this done, listen to the recommendation. And again, my colleagues, I apologize on some of this. The professionals do know what they're doing, and I did look up some of this stuff, and I believe Robert is right. Delaying this because we have opinions how we could do it better is wrong. I think HDR can help us out on some of this, of what is the next step of making sure this man gets in the right area and does it right for a temporary fix and then move on to the next step. So long story short, I don't know if I have to make a motion or if we already have one on the floor, if we need to vote on this, but I don't know about my colleagues, but I'm tired of hearing people's opinions instead of their facts.
Thank you. Just for clarification, the motion on the floor is a second substitute motion that has been amended. And basically what it states, I got to think of all this, to continue this item to the 2012 committee to check on the functionality of the gate, to do modeling, and also to include the language that HDR amend their report. I believe that is the correct second substitute motion. With that clarification, let's go to Alderman Malcolm Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just say that I would encourage my colleagues to defeat the motion that's on the floor. You know, there seems to be a plan in place. The motion is not questioning the process that our Public Works Department put in place. It's now talking about funding for a full project. And let's go to 2012, and that 2012 plan, monies have already been allocated. So I guess we create issues in the community by now going to these people that have been waiting in line for 3 and 4 years for their 2012 project to come to its calendar year, and we say, no, we're not going to do that because we don't think that that's what's best for the community at this point. I don't understand this issue about the gate. I don't understand how that has anything to do with the sinkholes or the modeling. I think we could do the modeling in addition to doing the first stage of this, which is about fixing the sinkholes. It clearly states in HDR's report that an alternative to what they put out first might be this other option that there's no guarantee that it would work. There's no guarantee that anything will work. So I guess we're looking for some 100% guarantee that this is the direction that we should go. We are constantly confronted with, on this council, with scarce resources, be they personnel, be it money, be it whatever, and then we have to make choices based on those scarce resources. Our Public Works Department has looked at this issue and said, based on all of the totality of the information, what it would mean to drain the lake and what that would mean to all the stakeholders and all the partners and potential pollution items or recreational use of the lake over the summer months. Taking all of that into account, which wasn't what HDR was part of the scope of their work, taking everything into effect, this is the recommendation that should be made. Again, I would encourage my colleagues to vote the motion on the floor down. This piece that Alderman Quaker is talking about with the changing and amending the report, I personally don't think it's necessary. HDR, we gave them a scope of work in which we wanted them to do, and they came back with recommendations based on that pretty narrow scope of work that we asked them to do. They then interfaced with our Public Works Department, and a recommendation has come forth, not from HDR at this point, but from our Public Works Department saying, based on what HDR has given us, we understand what you've given us, and we appreciate that professional work. This is the best direction for the city to go. HDR didn't take into effect or account what that would mean in terms of draining the lake from a standpoint of what that means to the community over the summer months. So I don't think what HDR's recommendations are what we're dealing with today. I look at those recommendations as having been filtered through our professional Public Works Department, and those are the recommendations that's on the floor. We don't shoot the messenger in HDR. We gave them a limited scope of what to do. They did it. The motion on the floor that's full funding, 2012, gate operational, modeling, and amend the report, in my opinion, should be defeated. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Let's go to Alderman Karen Olson.
I'm in agreement with Malcolm that this motion should be defeated.
Let's go to Alderman Ron Weifenbach.
First of all, I can say thank you, Mayor, for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. This is, we've been bantering back and forth, and I think that's absolutely necessary to come to a good decision. I want to reiterate a few points about building a bypass that we plan in the future, the environmental impacts of draining the lake, the cost for the financial fix for the lake. Those are things that we're working on with federal funds and looking in that. The quality of life in the park itself, in the lake, the impacts on the fish. I like fishing in the lake myself. There's been some things tossed around about HDR's recommendation. This is what they gave us, And anybody can argue that point. This is a recommendation that we got last council meeting in writing, and we can argue that point all day long. This is the first I've heard of the Public Works total recommendation to not drain the lake, pump the bentonite and the gravel into the holes. I think it all makes sense. But without this conversation, and when you look at this and you get this on your computer or whatever, and you look at that and you read it through, we have an expectation of a certain level of proficiency put forward before we come up here and make these decisions. So anybody they can say whatever they want about changing the rules or whatever as we go. As I play a game of pinochle with my in-laws when I first got married. They taught me how to play the pinochle game, right? Halfway through the game, they changed the rules on me. Never played pinochle with them again. It's important for me to know what we're getting into from the very beginning. I think that this conversation has been very well worth our time. It is the first absolute recommendation I've heard come forth from the Public Works Department that they were considering pumping this is what they wanted to do. It is in direct controversy what's written in this report. I got to say that, and that's undisputable and undeniable. I think that when we talk about looking at whether those gates work in the spillway, that's important to know that. I can't believe we don't know that, if they work or if there's been nothing said about what would happen if we lowered the level of the lake. That makes sense to me, and I can't believe that doesn't make sense to anybody else. If we lowered the level of the lake, it's going to obviously mitigate some of the concern that the council up here has about the guy fishing on the side of the creek and the spillway breaks and he gets swooshed down the river. And we're talking maybe one life, maybe 2 lives, but if there's a mitigation factor that comes from lowering the level of the lake, I think it ought to be considered in this proposal. I think that the fixes that we have make sense. But I think there is some merit to say, what happens if we lower the level of the lake? The modeling would also provide for that, I would think, if we know that there's 160 cubic feet or cubic acres of water in there. If we reduce that to, and I'll take some uneducated guess, but say 90 cubic feet or cubic acres of water, to me that makes sense that there's going to be a mitigation of risk that's involved for that guy fishing on the side of the stream down the river if the spillway breaches. So I think that I'm hoping that one of my colleagues can help me out and come up with something that makes sense. And I think that this conversation is well at hand, and I think it's been a well-versed conversation and one that was well needed. And I think to say that there's risk because we know of something, if you look at this report, we knew when they built the dam it wasn't built right. So when you build a high, whatever the word is for it, and you build a dam and there's any chance the dam could breach or whatever, you're going to have responsibility. When we decided to rebuild that dam, there was responsibility given at that time. There's responsibility that we take every day with building streets, those types of things. My concern is that we look at this, we look at the full in and outs of it, and we should consider what would happen if we did mitigate some of that by lowering the levels of the dam. If we have a gate that works and we don't even know that it works, I guess I don't understand why that happens. So if there's someone along the line could say, we should allow this, or maybe we should look at it in the modeling. I'm sure the modeling takes into account the 160 acres. Like I said, I won't reiterate myself, but I think it's been a good conversation, and I think we're going to come to the right conclusion. But I would like to see what would happen via a modeling of this. Does that gate work so we could lower the lake, and how that would mitigate some of the risk? I think that would take some concern off the council people who, when they go to bed at night, knowing that they made a good decision, and we did the best decision we could, and understanding that the hydraulics is necessary to pump this bentonite into those holes. And if we take that into consideration, if one of my colleagues would want to move that forward, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Alderman Bob Hurlbut.
Thank you, Mayor. I think Ron put it real well just now, Mr. Alderman Whiffenbach, and I wholeheartedly agree. I want to just point out that I think this probably is the right solution. The problem is we don't have certain critical items of information that could be had within a very limited time frame. To find out whether that gate works or not would seem to be relatively easy to do. To do the modeling would seem to be something that we can get done in time to have that information, so as Alderman Whiffenbach put it, we can sleep better knowing we've made the right decision. There are 6 votes needed to approve this tonight, and I'm telling you that I'm not prepared to be one of those votes tonight, but I think I may very well be in 2 weeks. And so let's take the time and get the information that we need so that we can be comfortable about this, and so that, as Alderman Hadcock mentioned, we're not just guessing it. And the bottom line is, even our engineers are guessing to some degree at levels of risk, possible consequences, possible solutions. There's a lot of guesswork here. We owe it to the people of Rapid City to narrow that guesswork down as much as possible, which includes critical information on downstream impact, which can be modeled out, and includes an option that isn't even on the table tonight, and that is partially lowering the dam by simply opening those gates, which may be the best solution for everybody involved. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I think we need to take the time and get it right, and I think we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Alderman Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to be clear on this, on what my choice is. I believe that HDR presented to the council a recommendation that involves reducing the risk through a temporary fix. If you analyze it, that's what they've done. Again, reducing the risk through a temporary fix. The end game is to fix this dam permanently and to do it right. Those are 2 steps to get it to a point where we can actually fix the dam. My suggestion involves reducing risk as well. It involves it in a different way. The possibility of reducing the acre feet in the lake thereby reduces risk. It's all about risk reduction. In order to do this, the gate issue is relevant, or pumping is required to reduce the risk or to draw down of the lake. Regardless of the solution that the council brings forward, we need to look towards the 2012 plan for the permanent fix and the capital improvements and other funding. The council, I don't think, would be doing its due diligence not to recognize that this $250,000 fix isn't the permanent fix. We have in the past, and we probably will in the future, move monies in 2012 for other projects. This project is critical to the community. It involves safety. I've laid out a way I believe that you can reduce the risk on a short term and focus on a permanent fix. We all agree that we need a permanent fix, and we all agree that it's going to cost money. I'll remind the council that we have from $40 to $60 million to remedy our drinking water situation. That's a fair amount of money as well. The bottom line is we need to reduce the risk, short term, and long term, permanently fix the lake. Again, it's all about risk. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go next to Alderman Lloyd LaCroix.
Thank you, Mayor. I think some great information's come out of the meeting tonight. I mean, when this first come out, I think everybody automatically thinks of the 1972 flood, and through this meeting, I think we've come to the conclusion that it's, the Kenyon Lake's at 20% of what it was then. The risks are way less, but yet there is still a risk. And I think we're partially responsible for this because in 2006 we put the filter in downstream and exaggerated the problems further upstream with the Roosterdale coming out. And so the information that some of the council's asking, it's good information. I think we can get it. I'm ready to. I'm not going to support the motion that is on the floor. The original motion I will support, for the simple fact that I do believe there's a piping going underneath the spillway, and if that fails, there may not be life-threatening downstream, but there's going to be some damage, and if we can prevent it, I'm all for that. So I'm not going to support the motion that's on the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go to Malcolm Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And this will be my last time speaking on this item before we vote, at least on this issue. But it's coming across that the recommendation through our Public Works Department from HDR is to do some short-term and reduce the risk. I don't know if we've not read the report or not, or if we didn't listen to what our Public Works Director said. That's the first phase, is to do this short-term fix. There's a second phase to do a construction. It says right here, construction this winter may be possible. There's some permitting and an RFP, permitting, environmental review, geotechnical exploration, and there's a cost estimate in there. Somehow we're coming to this conclusion, it seems, that the only thing that we're talking about is a short-term fix, and that's it. And the only way that we can get to this longer-term fix is that somehow if we take this money from 2012 and move those projects around, which I just categorically disagree with. It's clear in here that there are several phases to the fixes here. And one is this short-term immediate fix that can be done in 30 to 45 days, and the longer-term fix is reconstruction. Those are my last comment would be encourage my colleagues to defeat the motion on the floor.
Thank you. Seeing no further lights, I did mention, let's see, Jerry, did you have a comment or two? Very quickly, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. I guess these aren't on.
Where's the hand mic?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. All I wanted to say is the gate valve on the lake, we can get to work. We have had it working. It's old. It's rusted. The problem exists is that we cannot release enough water downstream for the amount of water that's coming in upstream to even affect the lake.
Thank you. Now, at this point, I know Alderman Hurlbut had mentioned that we did have a speaker request form from Dan Michaels. The question is that I'll put in front of the council is, do you wish to, well, I guess I'd look for a motion to open for public comment. Just keep in mind that we cannot be specific. If we open public comment, it will be open to everyone, not just one specific person. Having said that, the chair would entertain a motion if that is your desire.
So moved.
Is there a second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. And we're going to vote strictly on that motion. And let me ask a quick question. Are the lights to the motion to, okay, very good. With that, discussion on the motion to allow for public comments. Let's go to Alderman Tom Johnson.
I would assume, the chairman, that we have a time limit on that.
3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Bob Hurlbut.
Thank you, Mayor. I know I'm the one that made the motion. Just thinking about it, I know if this gets continued, then we will be discussing it again at a future council meeting, in which case Mr. Michael would have the opportunity to speak. So maybe it's appropriate that we wait for that occasion rather than opening it up for public comment tonight.
Are you wishing to withdraw your motion?
Yes.
Okay. Motion has been withdrawn unless there is another motion. If not, see no further lights. We are on a second substitute motion, and the second substitute motion is to send this item to the 2012, request the verification that the gate is functional, also ask for modeling, and also ask for HDR to amend their plan. Further discussion on the substitute motion. Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I'm a little bit concerned. We scheduled a special council meeting so that the community could hear the concerns, and now we're not going to allow someone to speak? It's a rhetorical question, but I think we should allow people to speak. And I'm going to offer a motion to open for public comment. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we have a motion and a second to open to public comment. Any discussion on that motion? Let's go to Alderman Malcolm Chapman. There again, just for right now, if we could just talk about the motion to allow public comment, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to make a clarification. If the council so chooses to have public comment, that's fine. But the purpose of this meeting was not to hear from the public. The purpose of this meeting that was clear to me, based on what council members asked last week or whenever we met last, was so that a report could be made so that council members could become clear on what was being asked and what this process was all about. It was not the intent to say, let's have a public meeting so the public can come down here and vet concerns, ideas, or what have you. That was not the intent of tonight's meeting. It was noticed as a special meeting, and in those special meetings, there isn't public comment. If the council chooses to do that, that's fine. but at least let's be clear about what the intent of tonight's meeting was all about.
Okay, very good. Motion on the floor is to allow public comments, and the chair will allow 3 minutes, which is standard operating procedure. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Motion passes with 1 no. Chair would see. That was the motion. So we are in a public comment period. What's that?
I vote no.
Oh, okay. Why don't we have a quick roll call, please? Just let's get it on the record. Let's get it right.
Johnson? Adcock? Earlbeck?
Aye.
Chapman?
No.
Wyffenbach?
Aye.
Olson? Kroger? Quaker?
Aye.
LaCroy?
Aye.
6 to 2, that motion carries.
Okay. Motion passes 6-2. We are open for public comment. If you have anything that you would like, I would request that you fill out a speaker request form. They're over here by the press table. Turn them in so we can recognize you. Go ahead, please. Doesn't matter. Motion passes. It's simple majority to. Yep, we're okay. Yep. Okay. So we are open for public comment. First speaker request form we have is from Dan Michael. Mr. Michael, if you'd please come forward, identify yourself for the record. And
good evening. I'm sorry I saw the speaker request forms, and I apologize for that. I would like to share, some 20 years ago, I spent 45 days on the ice and under the ice in Clancy Springs, east of Helena, Montana, on a Montana Tunnels project, where they were losing 300,000 gallons an hour. The gentleman's procedure for bentonite in the bottom, in the sinkholes, is a good idea. And the only thing that I would recommend is that HDR do their dye test with a fluorescent dye where they can locate the cracks and fissures in sinkholes possibly. But be aware that when we first did it on the Montana Tunnels project with the slurry and sand and mix to begin with in the bottom, the slurry, the bentonite was actually washing through. We then went to a concrete bentonite slurry mix. The hose was on shore, the divers were under the water. 40 feet of water, and the hydraulics of the water actually pressured the grout into the sinkholes, but we created more sinkholes, and we were able to cap and seal and protect the integrity of the dam. That's my only comment. I'd be glad to share, and I apologize. I didn't realize this was not an open meeting. Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Michaels. Next speaker request form is from McKenna Dell, 20 Anaconda.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Name's Kenny Dell from Adopt a Creek program. I'm a volunteer. I come here tonight just to get educated on what the problem is and hear what some of the solutions are. And sitting back there, I'm thinking, if this was my dam, what would I do? How would I spend this money? And it seems like to put the bentonite in the sinkholes, that's a given. You don't have no choice. No matter, forget the spillway even being there, the dam is leaking, and it has to be fixed. Even if you replace the dam or the spillway, you are going to have to put bentonite in those sinkholes. You don't have no choice. So I was thinking of some of the givens, some of the facts, and listen to the information given. The spillway is put under similar materials. To me, that sounds like a bad idea. No matter what you do to put that spillway back on the same location is wrong. The maintenance record ought to indicate that's in a bad spot. You need to move it off of that. I would move it clear down the other end of the dam myself. In saying that, you know, we're considering putting. It isn't working? Yeah, the battery went dead. Glad it wasn't.
Just a technical glitch.
Anyways,
Go ahead, Ken.
if you think about it, if you move the dam to the other end of the lake, we'd have the dam, or spillway, I should say, in the deepest part of the lake. That isn't necessary to have it there. Okay, thank you. I don't feel it's necessary to have it there. If it was at the lower end of the lake, water is going over the dam. It don't matter if it's 10 feet of water in front of it or 4 feet of water in front of it. You wouldn't have that safety issue. You would also have, if you got a bypass designated, looks to me like you need to put the spillway near that bypass and eliminate the spillway where you're at and make that an emergency spillway for extreme high water. But those are just my comments. I think there'd be a lot of benefits to moving that out of the way. The other thing, when you talk about your modeling, when you do the modeling, I think the greenway will accept the water. But what has to be included in the modeling is the debris load. That's what's going to affect your flooding, and those are the things that's going to plug your bridges, and all you have to do is go down Omaha and look toward Cowboy Hill, and you will see a lot of debris. And if you think it's all going to go through your bridges and not create flooding in areas that are not included in your modeling, you might be surprised. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We also have a speaker request form from Mike Derby, 2735 Country Club Drive.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. I'm Mike Derby, and appreciate the dialogue tonight. I was here in January primarily talking about the diversion piping and dredging the lake. I'd like to specifically address dredging the lake. In Mr. Ellis's summary, I don't think that was highlighted enough, that that's part of the end project to permanently fix the whole project, and that's to dredge the lake. Some new information on that. Steve Zelmer from the cement plant said that when you take the sludge out, or the mud out of the lake, that they would be willing to use that for reclamation. So I wanted just to add that to the mix of dialogue. But I'm very concerned about having a half-filled lake this summer for a variety of reasons, the negative impact it'll have on tourism and the use of the park. And so let's move forward with the temporary fix, and let's not delay getting the permanent fix done this year. A lot of these projects oftentimes take longer than we think they will, and I'd like to see it done this winter when it makes the most sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. I see no further speaker request forms. Anyone else wish to speak? If not, the chair would look for a motion to close the public comment period.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to close the public comment period. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. We have closed the public comment period. We are back to the second substitute motion. And just for clarification, I'll see if I can repeat it one last time. I'm sorry, it was the first substitute motion. Let's get this right. The substitute motion was to move this to the 2012 committee, to ask staff to certify or to acknowledge that we have a gate that is functional, to also ask for the modeling, and also ask HDR to revise their report. Everyone clear on that motion? Any further discussion on that motion? If not, we're going to go to a vote here. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Why don't we take a roll call just to be on the safe side, please?
Adcock? No. Robert?
Aye.
No.
Wyffenbach?
No.
Olson? Kroger?
No.
Quaker?
No.
LaCroy?
No.
Johnson?
Aye.
Okay, it appears the motion has failed on a 7-2 vote. Is that what you have, Jackie?
That's correct.
Okay, very good. We are back to the original motion. The original motion is to, let's make sure, Jackie, let's see, is to check me on this one, is to approve, right, actually there was two parts of the motion. The first one was to authorize the mayor and the finance officer to sign the professional service agreement with HDR, and also to declare an emergency and move forward with the temporary fix of putting bentonites in the sinkholes. Is that correct? And I'm going to look to Mr. Ellis just to verify. That's the motion. Okay. Discussion on that motion, please. Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. I have one question and a couple of comments. My question is funding source.
Very good. Mr. Ellis, funding source.
The funding source we've identified is Department 8911, line item 4371, and Fund 505. Perhaps Finance Officer can go into a little bit more detail on that.
Mr. Quaker, would you like Mr. Preston to
translate that?
Yes,
Yeah.
would you please? Mr. Preston.
Thank you, Mayor. What I recall is that Mr. Ellis had some funding from CIP that for some projects, and that was essentially the funding sources out of the CIP, Capital Improvement Program.
Okay.
Great.
Mr. Quaker, you still have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. So clarification, so the $38,120 for the additional consulting contract, which is in addition to the original $10,000, that $38,000 will come from that CIP fund, and then will the $150,000 to $250,000 also come from that fund?
Mr. Ellis.
Yes, you're correct there. And the reason for that is we had a very favorable bid recently. I believe it was approved at the last council meeting. And there was enough left over between the advertising authority and the actual low bid to cover both the engineering and the $250,000 advertising authority tonight. So yes.
Very good. Alderman Quaker, you still have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. So then the real important question that we can either wrestle with as part of this motion or later, but we should at least start thinking about it, and that's a question Alderman Johnson raised a few minutes ago, is regarding the funding for the end game, which is phase 2 of all of this. And I want to make sure that stays on the table, because I don't know what the funding source is for that. We're proceeding with this without having a funding source identified for the next phase of the project. And I'm not going to mention Civic Center, but we want to be careful and make sure that we have that funding available. A couple other comments. I believe that the request regarding the gate and the requests that I had earlier regarding the pins that were put in the dam years ago, and whether those have moved or not, I think those are questions that perhaps you'd be willing to answer without a specific motion from the council. But if you'd bring that information forward to a future Public Works meeting, I would really appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Alderman Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to echo what Sam had talked about. That's why I turned my light on. I believe that the council needs to keep both eyes open. There is an end game here, and the end game is to fix the dam or to fix the spillway, and that is a substantial amount of money. I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about it in 2012. That scared some people, but the fact is we don't have that kind of money just laying around. And we have significant other monies to spend in this community regarding, I guess, water as we move forward. So our work is not done. It's just beginning. And just to say I'm not disappointed in the vote, I believe either way we need to reduce risk, and we're going to reduce risk by this. So I thank those for the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Alderman Deb Hadcock.
Okay. The first part is to do the temporary fix, and the second part is to approve the $38,000. Am I correct?
Let's go. You want to address that to Robert Ells? Is that?
Yeah.
Robert,
if I
can
could,
you answer
Robert.
the question?
The first part is to authorize Mayor and Finance Officer sign agreement with HDR for the design services for the temporary fix.
That's the $150,000 to $250,000, right?
$38,120. Second part is to declare this emergency so that we can move forward and collect quotes to actually construct this. Now, the second item on the agenda tonight is the advertising authority for that, funding that emergency, which is the $250,000. That's the
Okay.
advertising authority that you see.
I'm tired, but the only thing I would want to add is, again, on the $38,000 for HDR, doing some type of either modeling, I think was one of them, and the other was, again, some type of seismic profiling or some type of geological cross sections to know what this area is before you start this process or while you're doing this process. I don't know how you do it, Robert, but how do I add that in the motion, or can I add that at all? Because I think those were two major concerns, was the modeling.
I think the modeling
and-
is actually well outside of the scope of the work they've done, and I think that was actually being done actually through the National Weather Service and who else?
Army Corps of Engineers, I believe, was also
Okay.
looking at it.
So that
So
issue
it's
is
being done.
That's being done, so I think.
And how about the, basically the geological cross-sections of this, can we add that to it in some way that, I don't know how, maybe they have a different way of doing that, Robert, if they can do it with the,
Robert? I think probably the answer, and I don't want to speak on behalf of HDR, that will certainly be work that is going to have to be, or basically testing that will have to be done as they start design work on the dam itself. Is that a fair analogy?
But the-
During the dam reconstruction, or even the major retrofit of the dam, that work will have to be done, and that will be a process that we'll be moving forward with very quickly. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay.
but then again, doesn't it make more sense to get what it looks like before you start the process than while you're in the process?
Alderman.
So I would say, if I could, I would like it in, I'm sorry, Mayor Hanks.
No, go ahead, please.
I would like it if we could in this process. I think it makes sense, again, to see what it looks like. Tell me, Robert, is it crazy to think that that would be something we'd want to do now?
Robert, when's the appropriate time to do the work? I think that's what Alderman Hadcock
I'm
is
getting
asking
tired, I
for.
apologize.
With all due respect, I would say let's wait till we do the dam reconstruction, because then we'll know exactly, oh, I don't want to get into those details. We should wait.
Okay, I'll leave it alone, Robert.
Okay. Let's go to Alderman Bob Hurlbut.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I just want to ask, we're authorizing advertising authority up to 250,000, but I guess my question is, we then accept bids, including particularly, or possibly from the gentleman from Newell, is that correct? So HDR doesn't recommend a particular contractor, they just...
Mr. Ellis. Joe, who's going to answer here?
If it's declared an emergency, rather than bid it, you accept quotes and it's awarded to the lowest quote. The statute contemplates that you'll try to obtain 2 quotes, so you can obtain the most advantageous price. But I think the point of the emergency is that you don't have to go through the formal bidding process.
I think to answer Alderman Hurlbut's question, though, is the fact that HDR would not be selecting. That would be something that would come back to the City Council for our determination.
Yeah, and I guess my concern is that I feel like that gentleman's proposal probably is the best one for us to end up going with, and I hope that it would be considered and it would not be just HDR's recommendation. My final comment is simply that I think that we could have done this in 2 weeks and been better informed, but I can certainly live with this, and I agree with Alderman Johnson that either way we are taking steps to reduce the risk in our community, and I think we could have been a little more responsible by waiting 2 weeks, but that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go to, let's see, Alderman Ron Weifenbach.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't think the modeling thing has been. I don't think that was out of the question to ask that. I mean, if we've passed this and then we know the modeling's done, it's a moot point anyway. After that, the only, I guess, the point would be is we'd still understand some more of the risk. The other thing that go back to what Alderman Hadcock was saying about the temporary fix. I think what our concern was is we're going to temporarily fix this thing. We don't even know what it looks like underneath there. I mean, in the future down the road, the fix obviously is going to, I mean, they're going to probably look at all the avenues of fixing that thing and moving it. I think someone had mentioned earlier, even moving it, so I want to make sure that we haven't taken any of those things off the table, the future fix of this thing. The 2 concerns that I think that the council had that aren't addressed are still the modeling of mitigating the risk by lowering the dam. That hasn't been addressed. And the other one is, you know, we really don't know what underneath of that dam looks like. I think Alderman Kroger had alluded to it earlier when he said it's been that way for 30 years. For some reason, I have a sneaky suspicion after listening to the conversation that went on today that there's some real damage underneath that concrete spillway. That by pumping this bentonite in there, you know, we don't know how much is, you know, it seems there's still a risk just by pumping the bentonite in there. I still believe it's better than doing absolutely nothing. but I just have some concern about if there was a way that we could possibly have some kind of indication of, you know, what's in there, what's it look like somehow. I mean, if the core sampling does it, I guess I'm fine with that. I just know that if we vote on this and we vote past it, already we've taken the modeling out of the picture, and we've also taken out the ability to see what's underneath that spillway in some sort of manner. Because I think that's the underlying issue, is if that spillway fails due to the seepage taking the ground out, you know, and look, you know, the bigger picture of looking at the dam in the future, I have no concern about that. I think that will, you know, that'll be put forward in some other sort of a, you know, a project plan or something, and whether it be moved or whether it, because there's obvious problem with it. This is a temporary fix. We need to understand that it's not a permanent fix, but, you know, even with the temporary fix, I think that pumping that bentonite in there makes sense, but at some level, you would think, I mean, I can't see how we're gonna find out how much or what we're gonna pump into there, and what, you know, how coarse we need it to do to get it to stick, those types of things. So I can live with the motion if nobody wants to make a second motion to provide for modeling and provide for some sort of ability to see what's underneath that spillway. Thank you.
Okay, we have a light on Mr. Preston. Do you have a comment as far as funding?
Just, thank you, Mayor.
Is it
Real, just
is it
respond to
dealing
the
with funding?
On quotes.
On quotes, okay, please go ahead.
Just the question that raised is Mr. Ellis has to get at least 2 quotes and bring them back before the council.
Very
on
good.
that.
And that's what's required under state statute. Okay, very good. Thank you for that. Okay, everyone clear on the motion? I don't see any further lights. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Everyone clear on the motion? Seeing none, we'll go to the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion passes. Could we have a roll call, please, just for clarification?
Hurlbut,
No.
Chapman,
Aye.
Reifenbach.
Aye.
Olson. Kroger. Quaker. LaCroy.
Aye.
Johnson.
No.
Adcock.
Okay, it appears the motion passes on a 7 to 2 vote. Very good, thank you. Well, we're through our first item on the agenda. Now we're on to item number 2 on the agenda. And just for clarification, and I didn't want to bring it up during the debate, but I do want to just take just a second and explain why I ruled the way I did, and that is Council Rule 2-12, and says no member may speak more than twice nor longer than 5 minutes on the same subject without the consent of the majority of the council members. I didn't want to enter into the discussion at that point, but it's very clear in our council rules, it's on the subject, not on the specific motion. That's why I ruled that. And quite honestly, it was a good exercise in parliamentary procedure. So thank you, everyone. We are on to item number 2. Robert?
Item number 2.
We got this one out of the way. How's this one looking?
Item number 2 is request advertising authority in the amount of $250,000. It's a drainage improvement funded for the fill and seal the sinkholes in the lake above the spillway to alleviate seepage through the dam.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second for approval. Any discussion on that motion? Alderman Tom Johnson.
Just briefly, the reason why I voted against the previous motion and I'll vote against this motion is I believe that there was a way to reduce the risk and apply this same $250,000 plus $38,000 to the permanent fix. That's the reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Johnson. Alderman Ron Weifenbach.
Thank you, Mayor. I missed the funding source. I guess that question would be CIP.
CIP.
Thank you.
Very good. Further discussion. The motion on the floor is for approval of allowing staff to go out for advertising authority on the Kenyon Lake Dam repairs, not to exceed $250,000. Is that correct, Robert?
Yes.
Okay. Further discussion. Alderman Sam Quaker.
Thank you, Mayor. Regarding the motion on the floor, and I'll ask the mayor if we can include it as part of this motion or if it's maybe a separate motion. We have got to keep the funding discussion for the rest of it alive. We do not have the funding in this fund to finish the project, and we all know that. And I do not want us to proceed, with this without at least, working diligently to find those funds. So I'd like to know. I believe that is. I think it is okay to to discuss that as part of this motion, is to find out where we're going to start looking and when that's coming back for further consideration.
Okay. I'm going to let you address that. Just for, there again, point of clarification, on special council meetings, we really can't add anything to the agenda, but I think we've been allowing an awful lot of latitude, and I think that's a fair enough question. So, Robert, as far as we've addressed the short-term fix, where do you see the funding for the long-term fix?
In my mind, I only see three alternatives. 0.16 committee, Vision 2012, and federal funding. Or
Okay.
some other type of state grant.
Or a state loan? Okay. Alderman Quake, you still have the floor, sir.
I would like to see that, and I don't mind adding it myself, but I'd like to see that added to the next Public Works agenda to start that process.
And Alderman Quaker,
You have a suggestion?
what we'll need to do is we can't actually make that motion, but you can certainly add that. Just because it's special council meeting, we can't add it, but you can certainly add that at your discretion as an alderman. Okay? Further discussion. Motion on the floor is for approval. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Chair would look for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.